Cold. An eerie silence, occasionally broken by a piercing wind with no people in sight. Amina, Zone 1. Wait, there's someone walking around. Are they being pushed by the wind? In these conditions, wandering the streets is risky. Every movement is caught by the camera's lens. Proof that it wasn't the end of the world yet. Not everyone was gone. But when the apocalypse begins, the scariest enemy becomes humans. The drone locked onto its target, with nothing standing in its way. Technology had advanced to the point where whoever had the best toys won. The target was visible from several angles, leaving no chance for survival. One silent, sharp, and almost invisible shot, and the poor soul was gone, minus an arm. Death was instantaneous. Bevrian did a fantastic job. Partner Ter couldn't stop raving about the new software that made their job easier. But Bevrian said it was too soon to celebrate. They needed to keep monitoring. He watched closely, blinking a few times. The drone spun around as if scanning the area. But everything seemed clear. Silence returned, no souls around, just the faint hum of the drone. The guys quickly got up and headed for the exit, with Bevrian leading the way. The drone, like a partner, moved closer with them. Ter recognized the man with long hair and one missing arm. That was the scoundrel they'd been hunting. Zone 1 was finally safe, a month-long worry resolved. Suddenly, strange noises came from behind Ter. It seemed Zone 1 had some contaminants, and it looked like this virus was waiting for a zombie to approach. At that moment, a device on Ter's body beeped, signaling it was time for medication. His partner handed a bottle to Bevrian so he could take his meds too. After that, they had to move immediately. Staying in one place was dangerous. Ter grinned widely, saying there weren't many left, so they could safely gather all the contaminants in Zone 1. Then he asked if Ruby would be pleased, but Bevrian couldn't be sure. Amina, the safe zone. On a rooftop, two young people watched the drone. One was a very pretty young girl with long blonde hair. She couldn't take her eyes off the drone on the neighboring roof. She seemed to be putting in a lot of effort, as evidenced by the sweat on her face. Then she closed her eyes, tensed up, and a blue rectangle glowed on her temples. The drone on the other roof immediately shot up into the air. Her partner praised Ruby, saying she did a great job. Now she had to slowly open her eyes. Then the drone started to tilt, and suddenly disaster struck. It darted forward, crashing from side to side. The drone was completely out of control. Her partner tried to calm Ruby, telling her not to worry, just close her eyes and let the drones land safely. His words helped as the drone finally went for a landing. Ruby collapsed to the ground, exhausted. She was so scared. What the heck? She couldn't control the drone with her eyes open, couldn't focus. Her dad was a pro at this. There were only two things Ruby needed to master: what she saw and what the drone saw. But how to focus? You'd need two brains for that. Her partner, Dune, found this amusing, as he was the complete opposite of Ruby. He struggled to control the drone if it went out of his sight. Ruby ordered him to take control of her drone too, but did she really think Dune couldn't handle his own? Despite his pride, he had to support his friend. If she kept practicing, she'd surely succeed. He'd told her this before, but what amazed him most was that Ruby could control the drone with her eyes closed. The conversation smoothly shifted to repainting the drone. It turned out Dune's dad loved the color blue, so he thought of using it for his device. Why did the info about Dr. Simon's favorite color amuse Ruby? Dune looked at his partner with a playful grin, as if he said it knowing she'd like it. He waited for the right moment to suggest Ruby try again. She focused, first closing her eyes, then gradually opening them. Before her, Ruby saw what the drone saw. Suddenly, she saw something that shouldn't be there. Ruby snapped her eyes open. Was she imagining things? No, it was definitely there. Someone was in the building. A few seconds passed since Ruby noticed the intruder, and she was already racing to the spot, Dune unable to catch up and stop her. Finally, he managed to grab Ruby's arm. What was she thinking? What if it was a zombie? But she insisted. She was sure she saw a man there. They couldn't check with the drone because the zombies would hear it, rush to the sound, and that person would be in danger. Dune tried to calm her, saying it was loud during training too, but the zombies didn't hear anything. Ruby needed to think carefully about what she wanted to do, as Dune thought it was better to inform the adults. But Ruby interrupted him, saying she couldn't miss this chance. They had to save that man. Dune realized he couldn't convince her, so he just sighed and agreed. How could he refuse his Ruby? Ruby's drone buzzed quietly near the building. The teens hid nearby, watching. Ruby tried to focus. No more impulsive action, she waited. Suddenly, she finally saw the man. She saw the exact spot. With those words, Ruby immediately headed toward her discovery. Dune didn't even have time to stop her. Though Ruby seemed reckless, she never forgot about her safety. That's the first rule of survival. But in her mind, Ruby begged the stranger not to run. They could save him. She wanted it so badly. Ruby barely entered the building. When their eyes met, that pale skin was the first thing she noticed. Why did Ruby freeze? Was she wrong and it was a zombie? White hair, pale skin. If it wasn't a human, then it was an enemy. Without thinking, Ruby aimed her weapon at the stranger, ready for drastic measures. Suddenly, she heard a human voice, the boy pleading not to shoot, his voice trembling with fear. Either this was a new type of intelligent zombie, or it was indeed a human. When the boy realized he was still breathing and hadn't been shot, he finally opened his eyes. He was polite, first thanking them for not killing him. Ruby was silent, in shock, so the stranger continued, saying it was nice to see a human. At that moment, Dune burst in with a shout. His gaze was fixed on the stranger, who looked just like a zombie. Without thinking, Dune opened fire on the zombie. Ruby couldn't stop him. But luckily, Dune wasn't the best shot, and all the bullets missed the stranger, giving Ruby time to explain to her partner what happened. His body and hands began to tremble with the realization that he almost killed a living person. But Dune decided to ask again if it really wasn't a zombie. The stranger trembled just as much, his timid voice asking them to put the gun away. He was already doubting if he was human. Then Ruby intervened and calmed her partner. The stranger could finally breathe. It's hard to think when someone's shooting at you. Ruby finally remembered her manners and that people don't usually start introductions with gunfire. So she introduced herself and asked the newcomer's name. But there was a little problem. He didn't remember his name. It turned out the stranger had lost his memory, but it didn't bother him since it didn't stop him from living a normal life. By the way, where had they moved to? Dune explained that this was their hideout, known to no one. But now the stranger was part of the secret. Ruby added that everyone should have a place to escape adult eyes. Suddenly, Dune noticed something odd. It seemed the newcomer didn't feel cold, but if he wasn't a zombie, he should be freezing in those clothes. The stranger agreed he felt cold, but shouldn't he be cold now? Before he could answer Dune's question, Ruby intervened, asking her partner not to bother the newcomer. She suggested they head to Amina before dark, as it was dangerous at night, and they needed to be cautious. Dune objected, saying Lisa wouldn't approve. Could they really take the newcomer with them? But he had no bite marks, and if Dune talked to his dad, he'd sort it out. Lisa? Ruby couldn't ignore the survivors. She couldn't do that. She had to show him to Lisa. They had to help the survivors. They moved to a large and beautiful building, Amina. Ruby peeked around the corner. Everything ahead was clear, so Ruby signaled the others to follow her. Dune followed, unaware that his partner knew a shortcut. He turned to ensure the newcomer was following them, but he didn't finish his sentence due to the newcomer's strange reaction, who was looking around with great fascination. Meanwhile, Ruby approached the door. She placed her hand on the lock, which made a confirming sound, and the door opened with the newcomer right beside her. He entered first, still amazed by Ruby's room. Dune said he'd bring some food while they settled in. Ruby wanted to say something to the newcomer, but suddenly fell silent mid-sentence. She couldn't help but be amazed by his reaction to everything he saw, as if the stranger had lived in a basement all his life and never seen the light. Ruby didn't disturb him, but suggested he sit down. He must be tired. That wasn't the case, but she persuaded him to sit as he needed to come up with a name. The blonde cheerfully jumped onto the bed, a smile never leaving his face. He kept his eyes on Ruby, and after a pause, he asked what would happen next. She hadn't realized she'd been silent for so long. His unusual appearance was so captivating. Ruby couldn't look away, but then she suddenly felt embarrassed and started speaking awkwardly, just to cover herself. She suggested Tung Tung, but even though he lost his memory, he knew that name wasn't human at all. Then Ruby came up with a few more options. Titi, Ro, Rara. Was she teasing? But Ruby wasn't joking. It was easy to remember and pronounce, and it was cute. But Roro, Titi, or Rara was thinking about something else entirely. Something suddenly intrigued him. His hand reached for Ruby's face, moving the hair that covered her cheek, and he saw. Ruby froze. She didn't expect him to do that. Her own helplessness in that moment was infuriating. Finally, she snapped out of her daze. Ruby swatted away the intruder's hand and hid behind her hair even more. He wanted to say something, but she immediately denied it, anticipating his question. "No, it wasn't a bite. It was a burn," Ruby shouted. But it seemed the stranger didn't understand what she was talking about, as evidenced by his confused expression. Then he finally got it and started denying everything, searching for something in his bag. After which he handed Ruby a photo. What beauty! It turned out to be a picture of very beautiful flowers, and Ruby's scar resembled them. It turned out there was a room with walls covered in flower photos. The blonde thought he could stay in that room for about a week because it felt good. There were so many photos, but he took the one he found most beautiful. Suddenly he blushed, saying the burn on Ruby's face looked like flowers, and he thought it was beautiful. Now Ruby was blushing with embarrassment, just as Dune entered, shocked. He brought food, and the blonde was starving and didn't care what he ate. Dune's attention shifted to Ruby, who was acting very strangely. Before he could ask what happened, his partner had already fled, saying she wanted to find some clothes. The door slammed shut, but Ruby didn't rush to leave. She was gathering herself. It was the first time someone said her scars were beautiful and compared them to flowers. Her heart was racing. Dune was in a stupor, so he asked what happened. The blonde guessed it was because he saw the burns on her face. After Dune's explanation, it turned out Ruby was very sensitive, as there were many instances where people thought it was a zombie bite. So she didn't like her scars. The blonde couldn't have imagined such a thing, but now it was clear why Ruby hid her face behind her hair. He decided to apologize later, after which he took a spoonful of the soup they brought him. Suddenly a strong nausea hit his throat, and he couldn't help himself. He had to spit it out. Dune couldn't believe it was that bad. He had tried it himself, but he decided to check again. However, it wasn't just edible, it was actually tasty, though a bit bland. The blonde said maybe it was because he hadn't eaten hot food in a long time. Dune didn't pay attention, just asked him to eat because the newcomer needed to adjust to this now. Then he lay down to nap, asking to be woken when Ruby returned. She was just returning to the room with a pile of clothes. Only then did Ruby realize she hadn't even asked for his size, but she took as much as she could. Better too big than too small. Ruby entered the room expecting nothing unusual. Suddenly she fell silent. Her body froze. She couldn't move. Because in front of her was Dune. Her Dune, who now looked like a zombie, and only a small patch of red hair reminded her that he was once her friend. Understanding of what happened and what she saw before her dawned on Ruby. She called out to Dune, still not believing it was her friend who had become a zombie. But instead of a response, the monster just opened its mouth to bite Ruby. The newcomer saved her from death, grabbing Dune at the last moment. While the zombie struggled to break free, the blonde ordered Ruby not to stand there like a statue, but to at least close the door. But she couldn't do anything. Her body wouldn't obey. It seemed like time had frozen, and there was a noise in her head. Suddenly her hands started to tremble. "No! No, no, no! This can't be happening!" Finally, Ruby couldn't take it and screamed loudly. It was a cry of despair. Suddenly, someone pulled her shoulder from behind. It was Ter, and Beverian moved forward, ordering everyone to step back. He pulled a weapon from his pocket, and tears welled up in Ruby's eyes. She knew what was about to happen, but her heart was breaking with pain. Dune, sensing his imminent end, went berserk. He started screaming and thrashing. Beverian didn't think. He acted mechanically, like a robot. Ruby's heart raced so fast it felt like it would leap out. She screamed, she protested. Then a loud shot rang out, and then silence. The newcomer was in shock and fear, worried he'd be shot too, but he seemed to be breathing. But he couldn't rejoice for long, as the sound of a gun cocking was heard immediately. Beverian's expression made it clear. He wouldn't hesitate, and any hint of something would lead to death. But he was distracted from another killing. Lisa arrived with another man. They heard the shot and rushed over. She peeked into the room. The first thing she saw was a pool of blood. Her pupils widened sharply. She knew well what it meant. Lisa's voice became harsh and stern, but it was clear she was hiding pain as she asked Ruby if she was satisfied. Was this what she wanted? Then she ordered her partner to thoroughly disinfect the room and not let anyone leave the building. Next in line was the newcomer. All blame placed on him. Lisa knew he was the cause of all this. She ordered the room to be searched and him to be taken away, avoiding eye contact with his child. The newcomer was led out of the room, his eyes searching for Ruby. But she didn't even look, her face hidden by her hair, but her tears were visible. So he lowered his eyes too, genuinely sorry, but he didn't know what happened or why he was blamed. Ruby didn't turn to him, even though she knew he was passing by. Dune wasn't breathing. He really became a zombie, and there was no saving him. Lisa barely held back tears. She'd never see Simon again, and now he'd let his son go, just like he let him go. Bevrian! She wouldn't just stand by, even if this time it was his daughter. Lisa asked if Bevrian agreed. But it wasn't a question, it was more of an order. His daughter turned their efforts to ashes, and this was the third time. Had he forgotten why their hope was shattered? Ruby was no longer a child. Bevrian had to stop covering for her. Lisa suggested he tell his daughter how her mother died, threatening to do it herself if he stayed silent. Suddenly, Lisa's voice softened a bit, saying it would be better for Ruby if he told her himself. Bevrian was silent, knowing not only his daughter lost her mother, but he lost the love of his life, and Lisa knew it well. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to another room. There, Ter told Ruby she should have told him first, and he would have helped for sure. But the girl didn't respond. He tried to support her, asking her not to worry too much, as he and her father were with her. Ruby was silent, unable to stop blaming herself for what happened, anger gradually filling her entire being. Suddenly, Ter's device beeped, requesting him to come to the conference room. He replied he'd be there soon. Then he offered more words of support to Ruby, but warned he'd have to lock this room, and she'd have to stay there for a while, not in her own. As he left, he said he loved his niece. Ruby remained silent, but the door closed anyway. When her uncle left, she stood up. Conference room? The girl looked around the room and noticed the ventilation. The scene shifted to the conference room. As expected, Dune was infected because of that child. It turned out he lost all color. His body died like any other zombie, but mentally he was completely normal. Ter was immediately interested, as they could make a vaccine if it was immunity. Lisa didn't hide that she initially thought the same, but the boy's body was dead, as she had already said. They couldn't find even the slightest hint of a vaccine in his body. Then Lisa showed footage from a camera showing exactly how Dune got infected. Everyone expected to see a bite or some abnormal behavior. But what they saw left the men speechless. They couldn't believe their eyes. That boy, he was much more dangerous than zombies, because regular zombies could only infect through bites, but this one was dangerous with just his saliva. He was mentally stable, which was the worst part. This made him a walking infection. So what was left to do, you ask? Ter suggested putting the boy back on the street. But that was a bad plan, as they needed to be sure there wouldn't be more infected people. So, Lisa said they would kill him. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to another room, where he sat alone. 5 hours ago, the poor soul sentenced to death had fallen asleep at the table. He was awakened by a sudden pounding on the door. He turned and saw Dune. What the? The boy was terrified. His heart raced. He was confused, forgetting he should run, but he started shouting, trying to calm Dune, even though he was already a zombie. And dead. Dune got very close, practically breathing in his face. The boy held him back as best he could, but he didn't understand what this madman was doing or what he wanted. Then there was a brief pause when Dune stopped getting so close, just stood there as if thinking or listening. And then he just turned around and walked away. What was that? How could a dead zombie still be around? All these questions spun in the boy's mind. Events flashed back to that room where he replayed what happened, unable to grasp why Dune hadn't even attacked him. Suddenly, a loud crash interrupted his thoughts. Ruby fell from the ceiling. She appeared so suddenly and skillfully, as if crawling through ventilation shafts was second nature to her. He wanted to ask a million questions, but Ruby wasn't listening. She immediately handed him his clothes and bag. The blonde reminded her there were cameras in the room, but she had it all figured out. The camera would show him sitting there for 10 minutes. Without waiting for a response, Ruby declared she would save him and get him out of there. After all, everything that happened was her fault. He hadn't done anything wrong. It was an emergency. So she asked him to just trust her. The frightened boy had no other choice. He didn't understand anything at all, and he had no memory to make sense of it. Ruby decided to continue through the ventilation. Though her new friend worried she might have broken something, she insisted it was an emergency and she'd fix it later. Suddenly, Ruby froze for a moment, and the blonde thought something was wrong. but it turned out she just remembered they hadn't picked a name for him. After that, she instructed him to follow her lead and descend, going first herself. Ruby was surprised he didn't look scared at all, even though it was his first time. It turned out he was quite athletic, used to heights, and could even jump really high. Ruby grew more intrigued by his lost past. Then she opened the box to retrieve something and showed him a drone. It wasn't clear if he had seen one before or just didn't know what to say. But Ruby explained that it was Dune's drone, and she wanted her new friend to take care of it. Honestly, he was just bewildered and didn't know what to say. He had no right to it at all. What happened was because of him. Ruby tried to calm him down, as she knew Dune well and was sure he wouldn't blame him. And Lisa would definitely have buried Dune with this drone, but he wouldn't have wanted that. It would be a waste of a perfectly good drone. So Ruby stated she wanted him to pilot the drone instead of Dune. Suddenly his mind went silent. He couldn't understand why this girl was being so kind when he had just killed her close friend. But something inside urged him to accept her generosity. Suddenly his whole body trembled violently, as if struck by lightning. He pulled his hand away and asked Ruby to put the drone on the ground, not wanting her to be in danger because of him. Ruby suddenly felt so sorry for him. This guilt that had settled in his heart, it was such a heavy burden. But her optimism didn't waver. She offered him gloves. She was so sincere and empathetic, saying it would make him feel more at ease. A sudden warmth spread through his body, and the guilt seemed less overwhelming. After all, someone saw something good in him, not just a monster. Ruby added that the drone hadn't been painted yet, meaning it was colorless, just like the blonde, he joked aloud. Ruby found it adorable that he could see the positive in everything. Then she handed him a bracelet, although they were supposed to implant a chip in the brain, but she couldn't do that. Through the bracelet, he could also connect to the drone. The rest was up to him. He needed to practice to learn how to control it. Suddenly, the drone smoothly and precisely lifted off. Ruby couldn't believe it. Was this really his first time? She was so surprised she nearly forgot about the batteries. He had to keep them with him at all times since the drone ran on them. The less charge, the redder the lines would become, and eventually they'd disappear. He logically asked how to charge the batteries, and was shocked to learn they used pollutants that released a virus. But Ruby explained that in such conditions, they used everything. They also took 2 pills a day as a virus prevention measure. He found it quite ironic to use a pollutant as medicine. After that, he decided to play with the drone, trying to lift it a bit higher. Ruby thought about the adults' words. They said this boy was dead, but the bracelet and drone responded to him. Moreover, the pollutant, which emitted a virus whenever a zombie approached, was completely still and unresponsive. He was no different, alive just like all of them. In her thoughts, Ruby completely forgot something very important. Lisa! It seemed she didn't really like this girl much. But now, her fury was unstoppable. Was she going to expel Ruby? Tare couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was this a joke? But Lisa was dead serious. Ruby had helped a walking virus and was still with him. If they continued to meet, Lisa would consider labeling Ruby as a danger and banning her from Amina. Tare stood his ground, asking if Lisa had proof that Ruby was hiding an infected person. She had always disappeared before. But this time, Ruby hacked the camera and escaped through the ventilation. Did Tare really believe the newcomer could do that alone? Chills ran down his spine, realizing Ruby had indeed done something foolish. Suddenly, Lisa started shouting, furious at the little girl and blaming the men for always covering for her. Then she just walked away from them, ending the conversation. Tare trembled with fear and shock, genuinely worried about his niece. Bevrian showed no emotion. He was always quite silent. Meanwhile, events shifted to the hideout where Ruby and Dune used to hide from the adults. The new friend recognized the place. Ruby suggested they hide there for a while. She'd try to find something safer later. She wanted to say something about food, but the blonde interrupted, saying he didn't need any. After all, he ended up throwing it up anyway. He initially thought it was because he used to eat rotten food from the streets, but the same happened with the soup and bread Dune gave him. Then suddenly his voice changed, and he asked Ruby not to return to this place the next day. To say she was stunned would be an understatement. He apologized for taking her hideout, but explained he liked it there. But Ruby couldn't just leave it at that. Without realizing it, she started moving closer to him. But the blonde backed away, remembering to keep his distance. Ruby bit her lower lip, gathering all her emotions, then suddenly took a step forward. The boy began to panic. It seemed not everything in his body had died. and Ruby might see it if she got any closer. But she ignored what he was saying and just kept approaching, until he had nowhere left to run. Where did Ruby get so much confidence? And what was she trying to prove? She just pinned him against the wall, like a cat with a mouse. Ruby asked if he saw it too. Nothing was happening. She got very close. In the end, he couldn't take it and turned away, unclear if he feared infecting her or if it was something else. But Ruby only grew more curious, as she was already so close and yet nothing was happening. So she went further and touched him. It seemed something in him hadn't died and retained its reflexes. He screamed so loudly, like he had just seen a spider. Ruby stepped back, startled by his scream. She hadn't realized how carried away she'd gotten and crossed a line. He screamed like a girl and called Ruby a pervert. What, her? She was accused of groping his chest. The blonde ordered this pervert not to come near him again. But she hadn't done anything like that. Ruby felt so embarrassed. She didn't understand what she was doing. It wasn't supposed to matter. She was just curious. But in truth, the feeling of shame was drowned out by sadness, because Ruby learned his heart wasn't beating. Meanwhile, events shifted back to Amina. The ventilation in Ruby's room still hadn't been fixed, so she decided to return the same way without raising suspicion. Ruby wasn't worried at all, even though she had broken many rules and argued with everyone. Because of this, she didn't notice her father in her room, who immediately asked who told her she could come back here. This question puzzled her. You don't expect to hear that from your father. But it turned out he was talking about the smell. After disinfection, the room could still be dangerous. Ruby decided to turn it back on him, saying he shouldn't be there either. Bevrian suddenly smiled. In truth, he didn't want to come there either. Ruby felt embarrassed for some reason and apologized. Her dad seemed to ignore it and suggested they eat first and then take a walk. How could she refuse her father? Meanwhile, events shifted outside. Ruby's drone jittered and took off. It turned out that while it was on wheels, Ruby had no trouble controlling it even with her eyes open. But she couldn't handle the wings unless she closed her eyes. And honestly, she worried she wouldn't be useful in battle under such conditions. Many people said they couldn't control a drone with their eyes closed. So what was wrong with Ruby? Her dad made imaginary glasses for her and said she could see the drone's field of vision. She just had to be attentive. When she closed her eyes, her vision stopped working and focused on the drone's field of vision, meaning she was one with it. He agreed that controlling the drone with closed eyes was difficult for him too. He lost control when he couldn't see it. But Ruby had her own strength. Only she could do it this way. Didn't she understand that? Her dad repeated that his daughter had an incredible ability, and he believed that with this skill, she'd surpass her old man. Those words were like honey to her ears, spreading warmth through Ruby's body. She had missed it so much. A wonderful moment. She wished it could last forever. Meanwhile, a new day dawned, and the vent grate was broken again. This time, Ruby carefully unscrewed the grate, then descended the usual way. She didn't notice she was being watched. It was Tara and Bevrian. They weren't just watching, they were analyzing her actions. It was unfortunate Ruby only looked down. She was vulnerable from above. It turned out Tara often watched her, but it seemed Ruby still hadn't found the answer. So he told Bevrian to tell her everything. Tara trusted her because she was his niece. But if she were anyone else, he wouldn't allow her to stay, worried she might be infected. Then he gave Bevrian his medicine and water, and her father promised his daughter would be careful. But how did he convince Lisa? It seemed she finally calmed down, although she was incredibly furious. But it turned out it wasn't that easy. Bevrian asked for 3 days to say goodbye to Ruby. And then he promised he'd take care of her himself. Meanwhile, events shifted to the blonde's hideout. By the way, he still didn't have a name. Ruby found him in a stance as if ready to fight her. She had already said she wouldn't come near him again, and he was acting like a shy little girl. Then she pulled out masks and suggested they wear them. Meanwhile, events shifted outside. To be honest, he was worried even with the masks. They reached the first zone, even though they weren't supposed to be there. But Ruby said they had something to do. The blonde's drone was under control, and hers rolled on wheels. It looked like Ruby was walking a dog, quite amusing. Suddenly, she finally found what she was looking for. Ruby explained they needed to find as many pollutants as possible because there were few left in the first zone, and finding them in the safe zone was nearly impossible. Ruby was sure tons of pollutants were in the danger zone, but she couldn't go there. She got into big trouble just being near the entrance to the second zone, But she was told the second zone would soon be secured, meaning the land was gradually being cleansed. Suddenly, Ruby realized her new friend must have been in the danger zone. She was so curious about what it looked like there. He confirmed the fog there was indeed terrible, but Ruby was interested in the zombies. For some reason, this question made him fall silent. Then he suddenly moved closer to Ruby. He was very close, literally breathing in her face, and said she was looking at one right now. Then added that if she got too close again, he'd eat her alive, his voice suddenly changing as if he meant it. Then everything abruptly returned to normal, and the blonde, as if nothing had happened, asked what Ruby planned to do with the pollutants. It turned out she didn't plan to charge the drones, just wanted to collect them for now. Ruby wanted to help her father in any way she could. She chose the largest screwdriver she had. The blonde was stunned. He thought Ruby would be better off forgetting about helping her father and just not getting into more trouble. Meanwhile, Ruby had already pried off the first pollutant crystal. Her friend asked if her father collected these things daily, but it turned out Bevrian monitored zombies and other outcasts. The area had to be safe for others to collect them. While Ruby was busy with something useful, the blonde suddenly noticed something. A gun. For some reason, it caught his attention. Then he immediately got distracted, thinking they'd find many more pollutants in the second zone, but there would certainly be more zombies there. Suddenly, he remembered that strange situation with Dune. He was a zombie, but he didn't bother him at all. However, maybe everything would be fine if he went there. Meanwhile, events shifted back outside. Ruby was hiding and shouting to her friend that it was getting dark and they needed to return to the hideout. She waited for him to finally hurry up, so slow. Suddenly, Ruby saw something out of the corner of her eye. Although there was nothing there, for some reason, she couldn't look away. Ruby looked closer. Then suddenly, no, it seemed like nothing. Or maybe it wasn't nothing. A zombie in the first zone? What the hell? Ruby just froze in place, her eyes filling with tears. She hadn't been this scared in a long time. At that moment, her friend returned. It turned out he had trouble controlling his drone. At first, he didn't notice the monster approaching them at all. The mass suddenly froze, as if waiting for some action from the teenagers. They discussed this thing between themselves. He hoped Ruby knew the monster, or rather, hoped it was just an acquaintance of hers. Then as the thing got closer, the teenagers screamed like little kids. Suddenly it spoke in a very low and scary voice, calling for a brother. Then it extended something and beckoned them to come along. Brother? Who was it talking about? The teenagers pointed at each other, hoping it wasn't there for them. Then the stranger threw something on the ground that looked a lot like someone's head, and then suddenly swung a crowbar he had been holding all along. The teenagers couldn't tear their eyes away from what they saw. Even though they were terrified, they should have run, but their bodies wouldn't obey. Then with a whoosh came the familiar sound, like someone smashing a watermelon. Even red splatters flew everywhere. Blow after blow, it repeated, and the sound grew softer each time. Ruby covered her mouth with her hands, unable to comprehend what was happening, too scared to even look that way. What was he doing? What was he doing? It was like something out of a horror movie. Blood droplets splattered everywhere and all around, until suddenly there was silence, followed by the clatter of metal on the ground. This psychopath finally had his fill, tossed the weapon aside, and now just stared at the teenagers. He extended his hands towards them and called once more to come with him. The blonde suddenly shielded Ruby, ordering her to run, and said he'd take her gun. The maniac just stood there watching, not even approaching. The blonde blocked Ruby and threatened the psycho not to come any closer. Then they ran, and Ruby asked how he knew about the gun, but there was no time to talk about it. The psychopath remained standing there. Events shifted back to the hideout. The blonde said Ruby had to tell her father everything, but she refused and only said that the psycho's appearance meant she had to leave the safe zone. Suddenly, he grabbed her hand and squeezed it tightly, then leaned closer and said that person was very dangerous. He was just insane. But honestly, Ruby wasn't too worried about that. She thought the blonde would eat her. After those words, he quickly withdrew his hands, shocked by his partner's calmness. In the end, Ruby agreed to tell her father what they had seen. But now the blonde didn't care. He could finally collapse onto the bed and rest. Then Ruby decided to place the gun next to the bed. The blonde didn't expect such gifts. She explained that it was dangerous to walk around without a weapon, that Psycho could come back, and the magazine was full with extra bullets. Suddenly, the blonde asked a very dumb question, whether Ruby knew how to shoot. But that's a basic survival skill. Her dad had taught her long ago. Then her friend confessed he had never shot, well, didn't exactly remember doing it. Ruby was surprised, wondering why he even grabbed the gun, and realized why he hadn't even taken the safety off. He just wanted to scare. So Ruby ordered him to come over. She wanted to show him something. But her friend started acting like a scared little girl again. He threatened to eat Ruby if she got closer, to which she just nodded. The blonde realized he no longer scared her, so he agreed, and they began shooting lessons. Meanwhile, events shifted back to Amina. Bevrian listened carefully to his daughter, noting the distinctive features, a mask and a red scarf. Ruby was so energetic and quick in her recounting. She also mentioned a white coat and suddenly fell silent. Her voice began to tremble as if she was about to cry. Ruby said he was insane and was hitting a zombie with a crowbar on the head. Blow after blow. Suddenly her eyes filled with tears, barely held back from flowing. Her father understood everything and just hugged his daughter. She didn't need to say anything more. Bevrian decided it was just a recluse with a mental disorder and promised to inspect the area the next day, asking where they had seen that psycho. Then Ruby hugged him tighter and shouted that she hadn't left the safe zone. Her dad pretended not to try to catch her in a lie. He decided to start the search from Zone 1 with Ruby's uncle. But if his daughter went outside again, he wouldn't be able to focus on the search. So Bevrian asked Ruby not to go anywhere at least the next day, and his daughter promised him that. Now her father could breathe a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, events shifted back to the blonde's hideout. His watch was working, which meant he launched the drone, tried to reassure himself that everything was fine and soon he'd be able to shoot again. He looked at his drone sitting on the floor, and suddenly a great wave of sadness washed over him. He still doubted and wasn't sure if it was right that the drone now belonged to him. Then he started thinking about Ruby, wondering if she'd show up this time. Of course, it would be better if she didn't, but suddenly at that very moment, he heard footsteps. He tensed up and began to listen intently. The footsteps were approaching, confident and purposeful, as if this person knew exactly where they were going and what they'd find. The drone immediately ascended. Then he pulled out his gun. Those footsteps weren't Ruby's. He was sure of it. The door slowly creaked open. He swiftly grabbed his gun, ready for action. Bevrian! It was him! The two almost shot each other. When the teenager realized what had happened and who was standing before him, a few seconds passed. Suddenly he was asked if he intended to shoot, though his hands had already lowered, signaling a truce. He was puzzled by the question, but then denied it. Of course, he wouldn't shoot Ruby's father. However, it wasn't that simple. Since the teenager didn't want to shoot, Bevrian decided to. The blonde didn't even have time to react when he heard the click of the gun. And then the shot. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to another place. Ruby climbed out of Amina as usual, descending with a rope. She noticed it was very snowy this time. Real winter was setting in. She thought she should bring firewood into the shelter. Speaking of the shelter, the scene shifted there. The door creaked open, and Ruby didn't notice anything unusual, loudly announcing her arrival. She immediately mentioned the blizzard outside and asked if her friend was cold. But there was no response, just silence. The room looked normal, as if nothing had happened. So Ruby didn't think anything was wrong. She just asked where her friend had gone. But again, silence. These games were starting to worry her. She sat on the bed and noticed a bag. And that seemed very strange to Ruby because he wouldn't have left his bag behind. Without a second thought, she opened the bag to see what was inside. Ruby immediately pulled out the familiar photo of that flower. Suddenly she was overwhelmed with immense sadness and pain. She remembered how Dune comforted her, telling her not to cry, that she had to get used to such things, especially since Bevrian was worried about her. But she couldn't stop. The pain was too great for her. Dune decided that Ruby was too attached to people, just like her father. He added that he hoped she wouldn't act like this when he died too. Those words hit her like a shockwave. How dare he say that? What did he even mean? But Dune spoke seriously and calmly, asking her to do him a favor and not make him worry about Ruby when he was gone. After all, they lived in a world where even people like his father could die, and he wouldn't be surprised if someone else died the next day. But those who remained had to move on. Ruby couldn't let the dead stop her. Dune asked her to forget about the people who were gone and instead find a goal and strive for it. Find a goal. That boy didn't know his own condition. Otherwise, he wouldn't have followed them or would have been very careful to hide it. But if Ruby hadn't met him, Dune would still be alive. She decided not to lose him. to be more careful and take her friends somewhere safe to prepare for the future, to make up for all her mistakes. Well, in any case, Ruby first had to find her friend. Where did he go on his own? It was dangerous outside. The drone was also missing. Maybe he went to train? Suddenly, a chillingly familiar voice asked where the boy was. Ruby looked up and her body froze. Tears welled up in her eyes. Her self-defense instinct kicked in, and she jumped away from the window. The masked figure kept asking about the boy, assuming Ruby had hidden him somewhere. The girl started crying, sweating from fear, while the madman began shouting, angry that the boy had disappeared. Then, without much thought, he jumped into the room. He took a step toward Ruby while she couldn't even move a finger. And suddenly, he screamed loudly. He wanted to know where the boy was. Ruby covered her ears with her hands. She had never heard such sounds from a human. Suddenly, a shot rang out. The masked figure looked down. Blood started dripping from his body. Ruby glanced to the side, feeling a jolt through her body. A gunfight was the last thing she needed in this situation. She hoped it was her friend returning, but it was her dad, which honestly was even safer. Suddenly, the masked figure started laughing hysterically. That laugh was definitely that of a psychopath. Then several more shots followed, one after another. And then the psychopath just collapsed loudly to the floor. Ruby finally felt a bit of safety and began to calm down. Suddenly, the madman's hands started twitching. Too soon to celebrate. Then he stood up with a characteristic sound, declaring that these pathetic people couldn't defeat him so easily. Ruby screamed in fear. A new wave of terror washed over her. Bevrian was momentarily stunned but didn't lose his composure. Her father fired again. The masked figure was already approaching them. But it didn't work, so he fired another shot. And then Bevrian realized that shooting the body was pointless, so he had another idea. Aim for the head! A very loud shot echoed, reverberating in their ears for several seconds. The psychopath's body immediately fell backward. Ruby hid even more behind her father's body. She asked if the psychopath was dead, but her father didn't answer and just ordered her to stay put. He cautiously approached the body to remove the mask, which seemed to cling to that pile of decay. Bevrian couldn't believe what he saw. What was this? The skin of this madman was completely covered in rot, just like a zombie. Suddenly, Bevrian noticed something else. There was something on the other side. Oh no! What a horror! This was definitely not a good sign. The scene shifted to Amina, where everyone gathered to look at the mask. The barrel. Everyone's faces were frightened and shocked. Lisa was furious. She was at a loss for words, but she still asked where Bevrian found this mask. It turned out he hadn't mentioned the psychopath, but now he simply said that the mask's owner had infiltrated the safe zone. Not those scumbags! What were they planning this time? Bevrian explained that the psychopath was looking for the boy. Him again, Lisa flinched at the mention. He asked why they were searching for that walking virus. Then he told Lisa she should look into it and quickly. Bevrian wanted to search for clues outside the zone the next day. The scene shifted to Ruby's room, where she was shouting to her dad that she was going with him. Bevrian said she already knew his answer. Ruby assumed it would be, of course, let's go together. But it wasn't, yet she stood her ground. Her father said her uncle wasn't going either, so he asked her to stay with him. Bevrian thought this would help the situation. But Ruby said she'd just follow her dad without asking for permission. Then she added, as if suddenly remembering, that she'd never been outside Zone 1, and then grinned widely. She finally wore her dad down. Bevrian came to tell Lisa all this, expecting her to be angry, but she was only slightly displeased that he allowed the child to go with him. He apologized. Lisa knew Ruby was a kind-hearted girl, and as talented as he and Milena, so she knew the girl would be useful. But still, she was a child, allowing her naivety and enthusiasm to control her. Right now, Ruby reminded Lisa of them before they made two mistakes, which was why they stopped accepting newcomers. Ruby didn't have many friends her age. Her father and uncle were always busy and didn't notice her, which was their mistake. Lisa thought Ruby wouldn't get into serious trouble as long as Dune was around. Suddenly, Lisa admitted that without Bevrian, she couldn't handle Ruby. She simply didn't have time for the girl and didn't want to leave her with Tyre, who couldn't refuse his niece. So Ruby had to be with her father, especially since it would make him much more cautious. Then Lisa finally asked what happened to that boy. Silence. Then Bevrian simply said he took care of him. Lisa was satisfied with that answer and didn't ask further. Meanwhile, a new day dawned. Ruby and her father left Amina. Tyre said in a very sad voice that he'd worry about his niece, then added that she wouldn't listen to him anyway. Ruby smiled to reassure him and promised to see him upon her return. Lisa said Tyre's drone would deliver supplies every 5 days, also instructed them to use the radio for location tracking, be careful, and warned that if the chip broke, they'd lose connection. Then she awkwardly punched Beverian in the arm, wished him luck, and said she'd be waiting for them. It seemed she wasn't good at expressing her feelings. Finally, Lisa looked up and met Beverian's eyes, asking him to be careful. Meanwhile, Ruby kept looking at that photo. For some reason, those flowers wouldn't leave her alone. They just drew her in. She didn't even understand what feelings they evoked in her. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to Sector 1, but it was still within Amina's zone. They reached there quite quickly. The weather was still just awful. Ruby mentioned this to her dad, worried they'd get lost, but Beverian kept checking the compass, so everything should be fine as long as she followed him. At that moment, the wind became so strong that Ruby couldn't see anything through her hair. Meanwhile, it was getting dark. The day was coming to an end. They found a place to rest and spend the night. Hot tea was perfect for warming up. Her father asked Ruby why she didn't just tie her hair back, but she said it kept her warm. But she promised to do it if the wind got stronger. So this wasn't strong wind for her. Her dad didn't pay attention and started sorting through the supplies. There was chicken and vegetables. Everything looked quite appetizing. But Ruby wasn't really listening to him, to be honest. Her father said there should be spare magazines in the drone, asked her to check. Everything was in place. Meanwhile, Beverian lay on the floor, looking at something so intently that he began to yawn. It turned out her father was studying a map to find a shorter route. Ruby was surprised that their search had a specific goal. She thought they were just wandering around the outskirts looking for clues. Finally, her father admitted they were looking for someone. Ruby kept asking questions until she found out it was an old friend of Beverian's. She kept asking, but her father asked her to rest and sleep. Ruby surprisingly listened to him, but still, something was bothering her. She asked where that boy had gone. This question puzzled her father, but he pretended it didn't. Then he asked what Ruby meant. The best offense is a good offense. And it worked. His daughter quickly turned away and said it was nothing, wished her father good night. She felt ashamed of her thoughts and that her father might find out about them. Then she tried to fall asleep. Ruby didn't even notice when she fell into a deep sleep, so deep that her dad barely managed to wake her. He lifted her up immediately and told her to look at something. His daughter barely opened her eyes. But it didn't stop her from seeing the monster casually walking past them. Beverian knew his daughter well, so he immediately covered her mouth before she could speak. The zombie turned out to be quite dumb, as it neither saw nor heard them. And eventually, it just wandered off somewhere else. A wide smile appeared on Beverian's face, and he wished his daughter a good morning. Finally, she was awake. Meanwhile, they had already reached the second sector of Amina's zone. There were many more zombies here. This was their territory. But they were all quite dumb and didn't pose much of a threat. The plan was simple. The drone would emit a sound signal, the zombie would react to it. Then it would be killed while its attention was focused on the drone. So even here, they couldn't let their guard down. Beverian was a true professional, so Ruby was completely safe. Although she was still very scared, constantly looking around. Ruby asked her dad if his friend was in a dangerous zone. For some reason, Beverian found this term amusing, but that person really was in what Ruby called a dangerous zone. His daughter felt uneasy. What was so funny? Her father said they were just in a territory not controlled by Amina, not quite right to call it a zone. Beverian and the others just called it the outside world. Ruby was looking somewhere off to the side. Her father noticed she was often distracted. So Beverian asked what she saw there, and Ruby flinched at his words. Her dad pressed on, saying she was constantly looking around and getting distracted was dangerous. He ordered her to just walk beside him. Ruby explained that she was just very excited because it was her first time. Beverian noticed she was slightly lying, but pretended to believe her. Meanwhile, they had already reached the cathedral. The entrance was completely covered with contaminants. Here they had a green hue, indicating a large number of zombies. Beverian noticed the crystals were glowing brightly, so there were definitely monsters inside. He signaled to his daughter to make sure she understood everything too. Ruby nodded. Then the heavy cathedral doors creaked open, indicating no one had been here for a long time. Beverian was the first. He didn't rush inside, listening for sounds. Then they suddenly dashed inside, Ruby trying not to lag behind. They immediately hid behind a pillar. Her father took out Ruby's drone. Then he whispered to his daughter, instructing, straight ahead. making a series of quiet sounds. Ruby's drone immediately buzzed. His daughter followed the command. Then it rolled to the end of the hall. Suddenly, the drone started flashing different colors and playing music. At this noise, the monsters that had been hiding appeared. Then the slaughter began. Zombie screams, a lot of blood. It was all Bevrian. He moved like a shadow, quickly running through those scumbags so they didn't even have time to notice or react. And now the cathedral was completely safe. Then Bevrian immediately called Ter on the radio and reported they had reached the cathedral. The men exchanged brief information about the general state of affairs. News. The doors were broken, meaning someone had been inside besides the 3 zombies. Bevrian had to check their stash, and he was there. No one had touched anything. There were 3 boxes, meaning they had a 3-day supply of food and other things for 2. Ter reminded them to take medicine and charge the drones. Bevrian agreed with everything when suddenly he noticed something and abruptly fell silent. His pupils suddenly widened, and his heart began to beat faster. Even Ruby noticed her father's strange behavior, which slightly increased her own anxiety. Had those scumbags been here too? The wall? The drawing was very large and red. There was hope it wasn't blood, but paint. Bevrian decided to check it. Unfortunately, it was blood. Then he told Ter, who asked whose blood it was. Bevrian hoped it was the zombies. Of course, both Ter and Bevrian were alarmed by such audacity, painting the cathedral walls with blood, but no one showed it. Then Bevrian promised to leave as soon as they charged the drones and said goodbye. Then her father asked for Ruby's battery. Suddenly he noticed something and a brilliant idea formed in his mind. He gave Ruby a cloth and asked her to wipe the blood off the drone with it. His drone blinked. Then it flew to a large contaminant and seemed to magnetize to one of the crystals. The battery immediately began charging. Meanwhile, Ruby started cleaning her drone. She didn't notice, but it turned out it was covered in blood. Ugh! But there was no choice. Bevrian suggested taking medicine while the batteries were charging. He said now they should take it 3 times a day due to the number of viruses. Meanwhile, the batteries were fully charged to 100%, so they quickly gathered their things and approached the door. Bevrian didn't rush to leave, called Ter, said they were planning to move on. Then he signaled to his daughter they could leave the cathedral. And the family quickly fled from that place, which involuntarily evoked fear. Meanwhile, night fell. The cathedral doors were well secured to prevent monsters from reappearing. Suddenly, someone creaked them open. One step. Zombie bodies lay everywhere in pools of their own blood. It was the mask. Was he back or was he following that family? After inspecting the entire cathedral, the psychopath noticed something. The cloth Ruby used to wipe the drone. In his dull mind, logical puzzles began to form. Then he looked at the drawing on the wall. He approached, seemingly interested in the same questions as Bevrian. That's why he ran his finger over the drawing to understand if it was blood. Zombie blood or human blood? He and Bevrian had a lot in common. Meanwhile, the family had already reached the border of the 2nd sector. Beyond it was the outside world. Her father stopped and told Ruby it wasn't too late to turn back. He even promised to escort her if she was afraid to go alone. His daughter silently looked at her father, studying his face and holding the pause. Then she asked if she could go first to the border. A smile appeared on Bevrian's face. He seemed a bit relieved, as if this question was a kind of test. But he didn't allow Ruby to go first. Meanwhile, some time had passed. The wind was strong, almost tearing the map from their hands. Bevrian and Ruby stood by the doors of some building. Then her father knocked on them. A few seconds of silence followed. Suddenly, the doors creaked open, but it seemed like they opened by themselves, not by someone. Then everything happened very quickly. A gun appeared from the opening. Then it was suddenly at Bevrian's face. Ruby screamed in fear, but her dad raised his hands and calmly said everything was fine. Then an old man appeared in the opening, asking in a harsh and unfriendly tone what they wanted. Suddenly, Bevrian began saying a strange sentence. Birds fly low, only before a storm. The man's eyes widened as if he hadn't heard that sentence in a long time, which was evidently a code word. He lowered his weapon and asked for a name. Bevrian gave the name Rowan. It seemed the man liked the answer, so he let them in, asking how Bevrian knew him. It turned out they were friends, and Ruby was in a state of shock. So they were seated at a table, and the man began offering tea or coffee, but Bevrian declined. The old man offered cocoa for his daughter, but her father held back again. Ruby quietly whispered to her dad that it wasn't polite to refuse like that. The old man chuckled, admitting that he liked Bevrian because Usually, young folks let their guard down just because he was an old man. But now he saw that Bevrian was definitely a friend of Rowan. He finally asked why they had come. It turned out he wanted to talk to Rowan specifically. Then the old man pulled a radio from his pocket, adding that the person they were looking for never stayed in one place for more than 3 days. Fortunately, he knew where he was at the moment. The old man then called himself Gray Mouse over the radio and asked for Hot Dog. Hot Dog responded from the other end, and the old man asked if Rowan was in their area. It turned out Rowan had been there just 3 days ago. A day ago, he was spotted in the Rhino District, which the old man mentioned was quite a distance from here. Bevrian asked the old man to show on a map where Rowan might be, and the old man started searching for his glasses. Meanwhile, night had fallen. As they were saying their goodbyes, the old man asked them to pass something on to Rowan. Now they were chatting pleasantly. The old man handed over some cigarettes for Rowan. After that, they left, and it had been quite a warm reception. As he closed the door, the old man noticed something. There was a chocolate bar on the table, but he hadn't left it there. He thought it must be from that kid, and it made him feel good since he couldn't remember the last time he got a gift. Suddenly, there was another knock at the door. The old man figured the guests had forgotten something. So, without much caution, he opened the door and asked what they had forgotten. But it was all for nothing because standing before him was a mask. When you're surviving in an apocalypse, the most important thing is to never let your guard down. Because just one single mistake could cost you your life. Day 1 in search of Rowan. Bevrian was telling everyone about the message regarding the birds that flew low. And often, from the very first line, they guessed that they were looking for Rowan. The second day of searching came quickly. Then the third, and Ruby couldn't help but wonder just how famous that Rowan was. On the fourth day, they were already fighting monsters. Still, they hadn't found Rowan. Day 5 of fruitless searching. Logically, her friend should have changed his location at least twice by now. However, Bevrian didn't lose hope. On the 6th day, they strengthened their search in the town of Booker. Shaking hands, they were told by the father that their long journey hadn't been in vain, as their efforts finally led to success. Rowan had settled in this town the previous evening. Bevrian and his daughter were offered something to eat while they waited for Rowan. Just then footsteps were heard. It was Rowan in the flesh. Before Bevrian could greet his old friend, he received a solid slap across the cheek. Ruby didn't like that at all. What kind of friends did her dad have that started conversations with punches? Rowan didn't let up. He approached Bevrian, grabbed him by the collar, and ordered him to stand up. Not the warmest of reunions, he announced that yet another fighter had gone to Valhalla. Bevrian hadn't spoken to his friend in so long that he didn't understand all these codes anymore. But Rowan just stayed silent. Suddenly, he noticed something that caught his attention. A pack of cigarettes. He knew exactly who could have passed them along. So without asking, he took one, knowing it was meant for him. After that, he told Bevrian that the gray mouse had died because of him. He was talking about that uncle who was shot by a mask. Ruby and her father were shocked. They didn't understand how they had been found if they hadn't left any traces. Rowan asked if Bevrian understood how important that old man's role was, and he just sent him into oblivion. He called Bevrian a fool, saying that if he wanted to find him, he should have remembered to cover his tracks. Then he suddenly grabbed Ruby. Rowan said maybe Bevrian would have been more careful if he hadn't been carrying this dead weight, then asked whose child she even was. He leaned closer to Ruby, not waiting for an answer, and said she reminded him of someone. Rowan reeked of tobacco and was generally a very unpleasant person, so Ruby immediately broke free from his embrace. Bevrian asked if Rowan had completely smoked his brains out and hadn't heard her call him dad. It turned out that the friend realized it himself, as she was a spitting image of Melanie, but he decided to joke around a bit. Ruby couldn't believe it. This was really her dad's friend. Behind them, Booker approached. He had provided shelter for everyone. Rowan thanked him and said he could get back to his work. But who was this jerk anyway? Bevrian decided to figure out why he was accused of the gray mouse's death. Did Rowan really want to say that someone was watching the father and child and then killed the old man? But instead of an answer, the friend handed over a photo. Very wordy, but it seemed Bevrian knew what was on that photo. There was that blood symbol. Rowan guessed that this was exactly what Bevrian was looking for. He explained that this symbol was left at the murder scene of the mouse. Moreover, several people they had spoken to said they saw someone following them from a distance. And although Rowan didn't fully understand why, those scumbags were indeed following Bevrian. After that, he finished his cigarette and ordered them to follow him. What? Couldn't he just open the door normally? Rowan led them to a room that looked like a maniac's lair from some horror movie. There, on the map, were a bunch of photos of that symbol. Rowan lit another cigarette, after which he explained that he had collected all these photos himself and that the file was titled Isolation. Because recently, it was Rowan who had been investigating the case of those scumbags. But what had they done that made Rowan decide to take matters into his own hands? It turned out that what happened to the gray mouse wasn't the first time. They had been underfoot the whole time. He didn't understand where this bunch of masked idiots came from. At first they were doing silly things, stealing homeless dogs and livestock, but then they started attacking people. At that moment, the men noticed Ruby's presence. Rowan asked the little Snow White to wait outside as the adults were discussing important matters. Ruby was getting more and more annoyed with this man. They continued their conversation. Beverian suggested that those lunatics were cannibals, but Rowan didn't think so. It was too far-fetched. He thought those masks were used for something. Beverian didn't understand this. Rowan asked if he had seen what that psychopath looked like without his mask. The image came to his mind when he first killed that masked man. The skin of that psychopath was rotten, just like a zombie's. And not just the skin, Rowan added that the insides were just as dead as that kid's. Ruby went outside as she was told and wandered around the area. She recalled Rowan's words. He said she was a copy of Melanie. Did he know her mom? How could her parents even be friends with such a person? Ruby was completely lost in her thoughts. But at the last moment, she noticed something. A snowman, so cute. Ruby was so intrigued that she even started talking to it, not remembering the last time she saw snowmen. She even came up with a name for it, Fruntik. Suddenly, Ruby heard something crack loudly behind her. She trembled all over, as if she had been shocked, but still turned toward the sound. The first thing she saw was someone's boot just hanging in the air. Then Ruby saw him, a very familiar silhouette and drone. She knew for sure this wasn't her imagination, it was him. Out of 1,000, she would recognize that face and those eyes. Without thinking, Ruby shouted to him, but she got no response. He just ducked onto the roof of a building and immediately disappeared. But she had to find out who it was. If it was her friend, Ruby couldn't just lose him again. She shouted his name as loudly as she could and ran in his direction. Ruby didn't even think about the consequences and that, in fact, the area wasn't the safest. Suddenly, a smile appeared on her face because she clearly recognized Dune's drone. There was no mistake. But he was jumping so calmly and easily across the roofs of those tall buildings. And he was even controlling the drone. How was he even managing that? Did he have such great physical training? He was moving at insane speed. She had to keep up with him if she wanted to catch up. However, Ruby wasn't that skilled and quickly got tired. Sadness and panic overwhelmed her. She realized she would never catch up to her friend like this. She would lose him again. But the worst came next, as Ruby suddenly realized she was completely lost while running. Now she had no choice. She had to find him before her friend got too far away. Ruby promised herself she wouldn't lose him again. So she gathered her strength and shouted sharply, as loud as she could. Ruby called out her name over and over, louder and louder, and hoped that would be enough. Suddenly she heard footsteps behind her. It was him, finally! But when Ruby turned around, how could she have screamed so thoughtlessly? She completely forgot where she was. This monster was enormous. She was used to feeling safe at home, but in the outside world, one had to always be vigilant. It seemed she would pay dearly for her mistake, but she had a weapon. All she had to do was aim for the head. But before she could pull the trigger, something very big and heavy fell on the zombie. The zombie was killed with a knife, a very familiar move. It was him, her friend. He yelled at Ruby that she was just a fool. Why was she screaming? What if a horde of zombies heard her? What would she do then? But honestly, Ruby hadn't heard him for a long time as joy had overtaken her. She wasn't thinking about anything and just threw herself at him with a hug. She believed her friend was nearby, and it turned out to be true. He tried to be careful since their weapon was without a safety, but he just collapsed to the ground, unable to withstand such pressure. Ruby pressed against him even harder. He asked her to be careful since they were on asphalt, but then he suddenly fell silent, as everything stopped mattering for a second. He felt warmth spreading through his body when Ruby pressed against him. His cheeks immediately turned red, and he hugged Ruby in return. He held her tightly, so much so that Ruby felt a bit awkward. She pulled away, not believing that this was really happening between them. He had really hugged her back. Ruby said he hadn't pushed her away like before, and the friend confirmed it. He confirmed it with words, after which he leaned closer to Ruby to kiss her. Suddenly, a loud slap echoed. It turned out Ruby had hit him right on the chin, and because of that, he almost bit his tongue. She started yelling at him that he was trying to turn her into a zombie, to which her friend said that even if they touched each other, after those words, Ruby blushed even more. He finished by saying that she wouldn't get infected even in that case. Those words brought Ruby back to her senses. Her traitorous red cheeks returned to normal. What did he mean? The friend explained that the area around the settlement was usually clean because they cleaned up pollutants during their patrols every day. But they grew back quickly and became very large, after which he simply took a piece of crystal and ate it. Ruby started screaming. What was he doing? She ordered him to spit that thing out, but her friend had already swallowed it. He explained that he was worried at first too, but it turned out it didn't harm him. On the contrary, the virus stopped working. But after a while, the effect wore off, and he had to eat it again. That was what allowed him to live among people. So he said Ruby didn't have to worry. Everything was under control. But that didn't change anything. How could they risk so much and make him eat pollutants? She wanted to know who taught him such a stupid trick. And at that moment, Rowan appeared, obviously looking for Ruby. It turned out that this man had told her friend to eat poison. And why was she not surprised? Rowan asked why the little girl had gone so far alone, as he had asked her to wait by the door, and added that her father was obviously very tired of such disobedience. That really annoyed Ruby. She couldn't hold back and started yelling that Rowan had called her Snow White and ordered her to go play with the dwarfs. So why did she have to wait by the door while they chatted? These shouts were interrupted by Bevrian, who had just appeared. He hugged his daughter tightly and thanked God that she was okay. He had been very worried, as it turned out. Ruby apologized and wanted to explain everything, but suddenly fell silent because she saw Rowan's face, which for some reason let out a dramatic sigh. And that made Ruby even angrier. She looked at him like he was her worst enemy. Even Rowan started to feel a bit anxious. At that moment, Bevrian noticed someone else. That boy. The father approached him and placed his hand on his shoulder, after which he praised him for doing a great job searching for Rowan. Suddenly his face turned red. He felt embarrassed that Ruby's father was praising him right in front of Ruby. By the way, she felt embarrassed by that too for some reason. Rowan silently watched all this and didn't forget to smoke a cigarette. The events shifted back a few days when a shot rang out in Ruby and Dune's former hideout. Bevrian was the one who shot, but the boy was still alive, albeit very scared. He was breathing very loudly, but that sound helped him come to his senses, as it meant he was alive. Bevrian reloaded his gun and commented that he missed. What a shame. The boy screamed and asked him to wait, offering to talk. Talk? Well, Bevrian decided they could have a little chat. For the boy, this was a chance, and he decided to use it to simply ask not to shoot him. He said, please. But that didn't work on Bevrian, and he just aimed his weapon at him, which scared the child greatly. The man calmly said he was giving the little one a choice. Either he tells the truth, or 6 grams of lead ends up in his skull. However, the boy didn't understand what truth Bevrian wanted to hear, how he ended up here, and why he had come. It turned out it was all because his expression suddenly turned very sad. He just wanted to say how sorry he was that Dune died because of him. And he didn't even know that boy. The boy spoke very quietly, barely holding back the emotions that had built up. He swore he knew nothing about his past, so he couldn't even tell anything. Suddenly, he couldn't hold it in anymore and let his emotions out. Tears immediately rolled down his cheeks. Bevrian stared intently at the boy's face, studying him. Could it be he was crying? Could a dead body have such physiological reactions? The man couldn't understand what was wrong with this boy. Despite this, Bevrian still held the weapon in his hands. He thought of his daughter Ruby and Lisa. These 2 women who occupied a large part of his life had completely different attitudes toward this child. Bevrian promised that he would deal with this boy himself. And right now, it was very hard for him to make the right choice. What was he supposed to do? Suddenly, Bevrian said, whatever will be, will be. The boy got scared, as that didn't sound positive. However, the man no longer aimed at him. He only knew one person who could take care of the boy. Rowan. He closed his eyes. Ruby didn't understand. Was he sleeping? At that moment, Beverian kicked Rowan's legs off the table. It turned out he was indeed sleeping. The father handed the child some cocoa. And to that boy, too. He even blushed from embarrassment. Suddenly, someone asked him how he was doing. It was Ruby. She whispered that her dad was cool. That made the boy blush even more. Beverian either didn't hear this or pretended not to. So the zombie boy decided to confess that he thought he was cool too. Ruby couldn't hide her joy. She was thrilled by this. But she couldn't help but say that even a cool dad had a flaw. His friend. But the boy disagreed, saying the teacher was a good person. Teacher? That surprised Ruby. It turned out Rowan had asked not to call him that, but he had taught the boy something, so he called him teacher. Incredible. How could such a person teach anything? He couldn't even talk to people properly. He acted so strangely. While Ruby was pondering, the boy took a sip of cocoa, which caught her attention. She shouted for her friend not to force himself to drink. After all, he said he felt sick from regular food. But it turned out everything was fine, as the zombie boy didn't feel sick if he had eaten pollutants beforehand. Ruby couldn't believe it. He explained that food didn't digest in his body. It just passed through naturally. He thought that was cool. Suddenly, Beverian started eavesdropping on their conversation. The man noticed that when he last saw this child, he was all in tears. But now he was smiling and talking with Ruby. He looked so happy. At that moment, Rowan woke up. Meanwhile, it had already gotten dark. Beverian was angry at Rowan for starting to experiment on that poor boy. But the friend had a different opinion, as Beverian still said the boy resembled those scumbags. Maybe they would find answers to their questions if they dissected the zombie. Moreover, he wanted to conduct a few more experiments. This nonsense infuriated Beverian. Had Rowan forgotten why he was expelled from Amina? However, he thought differently. It wasn't an expulsion. Thanks to that, Rowan could live so freely. So he wasn't going to listen to anyone telling him what to do. Rowan added that he would rather die than live like they did in their precious Amina idiots. And at that point, Beverian couldn't take it anymore. He understood all of his friend's anger and resentment. But there were limits to everything. He roughly and sharply pushed Rowan against the wall. The surprise made him spill his coffee. Beverian completely lost it and couldn't control himself. He started yelling at Rowan. But he remained calm and asked if that boy hadn't tried to kill Lisa. Beverian couldn't argue with that, so he called Rowan. And this time, Beverian had someone to back him up. Those words made him think. Rowan clapped his hands to bring his friend back to reality and asked him not to get involved if he wasn't going to take responsibility. Since Beverian had been silent when he heard about the impact of pollutants on children, Rowan advised him not to dwell on such things. Those words were like cold water to him. He suddenly began to understand what was really happening. So he finally let go of Rowan. The friend advised Beverian to look at it positively, as no one would ever kill the boy if he was under his care. Beverian turned his gaze away, because that scumbag was damn right. Rowan felt he had gone too far, so he promised to think carefully about the dissection. That meant he would let the boy live. Because of Beverian, he was still alive and wasn't complaining about his health. Rowan promised to remember that for the rest of his life. Then his voice suddenly changed, becoming softer, and Rowan confessed that he didn't hate his friend, but quite the opposite. So he suggested they be friends. Just like that, out of the blue. Even such armor could have feelings and warmth inside. After which Rowan left, as that was already too much emotional display for him. Meanwhile, some time had passed. It was time to eat. Ruby asked her father if they needed to escort them. There was so much enthusiasm in her voice. She didn't even hide it from her father, as she would be very interested in taking a walk with them. Beverian asked if this was what he thought. Ruby blushed, realizing she had gone too far with her honesty and made up that it would just be more fun together. In the end, the father pretended to believe it, which delighted his daughter. They would escort their friends. But he had only one question. Did Ruby even know his name? And that question threw her into a stupor. She decided to fix the situation at that very moment. The zombie boy completely forgot that he still hadn't introduced himself. Both Ruby and her friend were at a loss without names. It was so awkward. How had they been communicating all this time? Arvin. His name was Arvin. Ruby couldn't believe he actually had a name. Did he come up with it himself? Arvin was surprised by such a strange reaction from his friend. At that moment, Rowan appeared and said that Arvin was a beggar who owed him for life. He gave the boy that name so he wouldn't forget his debt. That really irritated Ruby. She just knew it wouldn't be without that stupid scumbag. Rowan quickly covered her mouth, telling her not to meddle in his business, as Arvin belonged to him anyway. That made Ruby even angrier. She started screaming like a madwoman. Even Arvin felt embarrassed for his friend. She couldn't stand that Rowan considered Arvin his property, but the man was pleased that Ruby was calling his property by name. That meant she acknowledged that Arvin belonged to Rowan. Ruby had no way to argue. That scumbag just wouldn't listen to her. After which, he simply left, saying he wanted to eat. How badly she wanted to punch that stupid, arrogant face. Arvon was concerned about his friend's state. He defended Rowan, saying he was just joking, and asked her to forgive the teacher. But Ruby was silent. She completely turned away. Arvin was scared that his friend was crying. What an idiot. Meanwhile, dinner was just ready. The overall mood had improved, and everyone sat down together at the table. Bevrian knew how to cook deliciously. However, scumbag Rowan couldn't help but ruin something. He said time was passing, but some things remained unchanged. He was tired of eating the same thing all the time. Before he could ask if it might be worth preparing something different, his plate was taken away. It was Ruby. She was smiling so sweetly, as if she were doing something good. Maybe she was enjoying Rowan's stupid face. He looked shocked. Ruby said it seemed the man didn't really want to try what her dad had lovingly prepared, so she asked him not to force himself to eat. Arvin could barely contain his smile. It was written all over his forehead. Yes, that's my girl. Rowan reached out to take his plate, but Ruby quickly snatched it away. She kept her smile, not breaking character as the good girl who was doing Rowan a favor after all. This infuriated the man, who cursed at Ruby, prompting Bevrian to step in and cover his friend's mouth. Ruby took a defensive stance, ready to fight, but her face clearly showed how much that idiot annoyed her. Rowan exhaled and sat back down. He was no different from a child. Infuriating, infuriating, infuriating. Meanwhile, night had already fallen. Bevrian was talking on the radio with Ter. He wasn't thrilled that they were left alone with Rowan, but the main thing was that Lisa didn't find out. Ter was worried about his friends, especially since that Rowan was a loose cannon. Bevrian tried to reassure his friend, saying that Rowan was also looking for a mask. Just then, Rowan appeared. He guessed the men were gossiping about him. Ter would recognize that voice even after 20 years. He quickly said goodbye and ducked out. Rowan also recognized Ter's voice and called him an idiot. Bevrian ignored this. He remained calm and played the adult. So he changed the subject and asked what the kids had been up to. Rowan sat down next to him, saying they had gone to bed. Bevrian asked if Arvin had too. He found that surprising. It turned out his friend thought zombies didn't need sleep, but he had fallen asleep anyway. In reality, Rowan wasn't stupid and understood that Bevrian was changing the subject, but he still declared he wanted to know the whole truth about Amina. What had happened there? Bevrian wasn't very talkative. He said some events occurred that Lisa called mistakes. They happened right after Rowan left Amina. He asked if his friend remembered Simon. Rowan's hand immediately trembled at the mention of that name. Bevrian noticed this, but Rowan remained silent, lost in his thoughts. Eventually, he admitted he remembered the professor very well, who had refused to make him a drone. Lisa was his assistant. They were working on research, claiming they would cleanse the earth of pollutants. Rowan recalled how Bevrian's wife, Melanie, smiled when they talked about how she was looking forward to that moment. Rowan kept nervously tapping on the table. He hadn't heard about those experiments in over 10 years and thought it was all over. But it turned out they were still working on that idea. However, Bevrian confessed they had stopped the experiments after the first of the two incidents. Then he briefly said that Simon had died, and Rowan immediately stopped tapping on the table. Now he was listening intently. It felt like the tension in the room had suddenly dropped. It turned out they found a child, about 5 years old, and everyone was thrilled to have a new person, especially since the little one showed no signs of bites. So they took him in at Amina, and Simon started to take care of the child himself. Everyone was calm because no one, absolutely no one, noticed a tiny scratch on his finger. The child turned into a zombie and attacked Simon. The professor managed to kill the child, but the zombie still bit him. The professor died. And for the first time, they encountered the loners right after that. They were the first to come to them. They looked like a pitiful and completely innocent couple who just didn't know where to go. The woman was pregnant. Her waters had just broken. They even forgot about searching for bites, wanting to save the mother and child. As it turned out later, they knew they were infected and had a plan. They started causing chaos even before fully turning, and many people ended up bitten and infected. And Bevrian's voice suddenly trembled. Among them was Melanie. He looked down, unable to raise his gaze, fearing he wouldn't be able to handle his emotions. After that, they found signs of masks on the dead bodies. With that, Bevrian finished his story. It was all Rowan wanted to know. His friends suddenly apologized for making him remember Melanie, even though Bevrian didn't need reminding, since Ruby was her spitting image. The father couldn't help but agree they were like two peas in a pod, which made him smile. However, the happiness didn't last long, as the information Rowan had was completely different. What? Simon didn't die. What? Bevrian couldn't believe it, but Rowan repeated that Simon was alive. He stared at his friend's face for a long time, trying to figure out if he was joking. Eventually, Bevrian felt utterly lost, unable to grasp where the truth lay. How? How did he survive? Rowan didn't know, but he could definitely say that Simon didn't die after the events Bevrian had described. After all, Rowan had found traces of Simon. He figured he had been conducting experiments in that place, so he hadn't thought much of it. Rowan said they were too naive in Amina, and that was their biggest problem. Bevrian didn't dispute that, but he still believed that what Rowan was doing in Amina was wrong. Wrong? He hadn't even considered that. Bevrian had held on for a long time, but he couldn't anymore. Rowan had thrown his friend off the roof of a building. But to him, it wasn't a bad thing, because thanks to that, they, the naive fools, were still alive. And suddenly, Bevrian realized that Ter was right. Rowan was unhinged, and his actions were completely unpredictable. But that was exactly why he always got what he wanted. Bevrian needed his help. They needed someone like Rowan who could work calmly in the outside world. He had to secure support and safely lead them all. Bevrian had been silent all this time, lost in thought, when suddenly Rowan called his name. The man had definitely been quiet, but evidently his actions spoke for themselves. Because Rowan simply said that Bevrian would be fine. He could do it. That jerk scared him more and more. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to another location. Ruby was staring at their drones, unable to sleep. More specifically, she was looking at the Dune drone. Suddenly, a wave of sadness washed over her. It reminded her of her friend, her best friend, who was no longer there. Arvin drove those thoughts away. He lay on the bed next to her and noticed that his friend had suddenly become sad. Ruby thought he was already asleep, so she smiled, hoping Arvin wouldn't see her true feelings. But it was too late. He understood perfectly well why Ruby was so down. That guilt loomed over him every day, and he couldn't do anything about it. However, Ruby simply wished him good night before Arvin started talking about Dune. Just in time because he was about to say something, but he realized it wasn't worth it. So he just wished her good night. Meanwhile, dawn was breaking. Everyone woke up and went to carry out their morning routine before it became trendy. Ruby asked her father why they needed to find the professor, why they needed his corpse. The daughter didn't yet know that Simon was most likely alive. Bevrian was just about to tell her. Ruby couldn't believe what she heard. Dune's father was alive. The new adventure sparked her curiosity. She wanted to know everything. Bevrian said they would be searching for traces left by Simon and might find his notes or something like that. The father believed that if they found the professor's records, they would learn a lot. In any case, the mere fact of their existence confirmed once again that Simon was indeed alive. If the professor was still alive, they could thaw out their research, and everything would return to how it was. They would live as they did before. Bevrian knew they couldn't continue the research without Professor Simon. He suddenly remembered Lisa's words, who said he was a true genius, and she didn't even come close to him. And she knew that Bevrian understood this too, as time passed, and the pollutants weren't going anywhere. They had made up all this just to calm the others. Bevrian didn't even notice how he got lost in memories. His thoughts were interrupted by Arvin, who brought the man a towel. Now Bevrian was friendly with him since Lisa wasn't around. Ruby watched this closely, until they locked eyes. The girl immediately broke into a wide smile, causing Arvin to blush sharply. On his pale skin, it was even more noticeable. He sat down next to her to wash his face and asked if the water was cold for Ruby. Then he offered to warm it up for her. He assured her it would only take 5 minutes and tried not to look at his friend to avoid getting even more embarrassed. However, Ruby felt shy herself, after which she patted Arvin on the head, finding the gesture so sweet. Meanwhile, Bevrian was returning. Suddenly he saw something. There stood Rowan next to a man with a horse. They were having a conversation. When Beverian approached, the man suddenly left. Rowan explained that he had to borrow something and that two more would arrive soon. It turned out he had already taught Arvon how to ride, so Beverian would go with Ruby. His daughter had never seen these animals in real life. Rowan suggested at least teaching her a bit about handling horses. It would come in handy. To be honest, Beverian wasn't too thrilled about the idea. He asked if they could do without it, but Rowan disagreed, because he didn't want to take any risks. Rowan stated that he didn't care what they did in Amina, but the rest didn't, and they would treat him like garbage just because he would be around them. Beverian wanted to say he understood everything, but he was interrupted. Rowan seemed to threaten that he could sell both him and his daughter right now. After all, the word friendship didn't exist in this world. Just as they used him, Rowan would use them when he needed to. He wouldn't side with people if he had to choose between them and zombies. So he advised Beverian not to trust anyone, after which he simply rode off, leaving the man alone with his thoughts. Ruby was very excited to see a horse for the first time. Suddenly, Rowan appeared behind her and said to apologize to the mare in advance, as carrying two bodies on her back wasn't easy. Beverian preempted an argument by taking Ruby to teach her how to ride. She was so small that she could barely climb onto the horse by herself. But as soon as she sat down, all her anger and aggression towards Rowan vanished in an instant. Beverian asked if she liked it, but there was really no need for that, as Ruby's face said it all. Rowan interrupted such a special moment for the girl, asking her father to keep an eye on his drone just in case, because there were no pollutants in the forest, and thus it was impossible to charge it there. He continued to give orders. Arvin was responsible for all the food, so he had to ride very carefully. Rowan was to ride first and Beverian last, after which they set off on a long journey. Meanwhile, they had already reached the forest and it started to snow. The road was heavily snowed in. There were a lot of trees around. Ruby didn't know what the forest looked like, so she asked if this was it. The father said that obviously his daughter would like it more in spring or summer when everything would be covered in greenery. Then Ruby turned to her horse, whom she had named Pan Pan. Arvin heard this, another strange name from his friend. To everyone's surprise, Rowan was silent. Suddenly, he noticed a strange mark on a branch. Rowan immediately called for Rowan, but he didn't mention his find. He just said that his horse was obviously tired, so they would stop to rest in order to start a fire while Rowan scouted the area. After which he simply vanished, not even giving his friends a chance to say a word. Ruby thought that maybe Rowan had been here before. Beverian immediately set to fulfilling his friend's request, and after a while there was already a campfire. Arvin noticed that the fire held up well despite the strong wind. It turned out that Beverian had built it in a special way, after which the man took out some pills and gave them to his daughter. At that moment, a loud crunch was heard. It turned out that Arvin was eating his crystals. Beverian had never seen the boy do that before, but now he finally understood what Rowan had been talking about. He decided to ask the boy if it helped him. But Ruby immediately intervened, saying it was dangerous, and ordered him to spit out that poison immediately. Of course, it was good that Arvin could be among people this way, but they had no guarantees that it wasn't dangerous for his life. Maybe it was gradually poisoning his body. Beverian watched his daughter closely and understood that she was indeed worried about that boy. After which, he called Ter. Ruby was very happy to hear her uncle. It turned out he wanted to find out their location using the drone to send supplies. At that moment, Beverian's head lit up, indicating that the drone was connected. Ter had already seen the drone too. The whole system was working very quickly and efficiently. He also asked them to do the same the next day so they wouldn't get lost. And he asked to send the drone back as soon as they received the supplies. Then Beverian suddenly asked his friend to send more food. Ter asked if it was for Rowan, but without waiting for an answer, he said he would do everything if the drone held up. Beverian didn't respond to that question, so Ter asked how their journey had been. Ruby prepared to listen and respond, but her dad suddenly stood up and was about to leave. What was he hiding? Ruby felt sad, saying that her dad had left her alone again. But Arvon heard this and wanted to comfort her, saying he was right there. It turned out that Beverian had stepped away to share the latest news. Ter couldn't believe that Simon was alive. Beverian also told him about their search for Simon's records. He too wanted to believe that his old friend was alive. However, for some reason, Ter wasn't as thrilled about it. He started shouting. Beverian stopped him, asking him not to say anything to Lisa, after which he was about to say goodbye and leave. But Ter wanted to say one last thing. He reminded Beverian that Rowan was unhinged, and he asked him not to forget that. But the man understood that perfectly well himself. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to Rowan. He walked slowly, thinking about his friend Peter. Even though they were friends, meeting like this was impossible. It turned out that a few hours ago, Rowan had been told to stop by Peter's place on the way. He was supposed to be in Square T19. Suddenly, Rowan stopped and stared for a long time. A bunch of tracks in the snow. It seemed he had found what he was looking for. Rowan knew that Peter's group had only 4 people, but there were many more tracks than they could have left. He decided to get off his horse and continue on foot, but not without a weapon. Rowan felt there could be something dangerous here, and it seemed his intuition was right. It was them, the loners. Were they climbing over each other's heads to paint their emblem? Rowan cautiously approached one of the bodies, but he only counted 3. Which one was Peter? And where was the 4th? Moreover, that trio had already started to turn into zombies. Rowan carefully lifted one of their hands. There were no hands. Did these loners have some kind of fetish for tearing off hands? Well, another photo would be added to the collection. But for now, that was all the evidence Rowan had. No motive, no identities. While the photo was printing, Rowan suddenly noticed something. Something strange in the tracks. One track was different from the rest. It seemed a rat had made its way into the forest. Meanwhile, the others were waiting for Rowan, who had been gone for quite a while. Suddenly, a strange crunch was heard behind Beverian. He whispered to Arvin to be on guard too. He gestured for him to be quiet, after which he carefully began to wake Ruby. And now they were all hidden behind the trees, waiting for their guests. It turned out that the snow was crunching underfoot, and the sound was getting closer, until they saw the silhouette of a man. He seemed quite friendly. He immediately showed he was unarmed and swore he didn't even know how to shoot. The man asked if he could sit by the fire too, but he didn't even wait for an answer and sat down himself, saying that they could even keep him in their sights if they were scared, but he swore he would leave as soon as he warmed up. After which, he inexplicably started rummaging through his bag. He pulled something out and skewered it on a stick. Then he began to cook while humming a tune. This old man looked very calm and relaxed. In such a world, that was strange. The guys were also surprised that their guest acted as if he had just walked into his own home. The old man even offered them to try what he had made, but Beverian said they weren't hungry. The man continued to chat amiably, swearing that his food was very tasty. Suddenly, the sound of a horse's hooves was heard, and the old man asked if there was anyone else with them. Arvon called for Rowan, causing the old man to suddenly tremble, as if he had been shocked. The man even stuttered, though he tried to hide his anxiety, and asked Arvin if he had just called for Rowan. After which, the old man abruptly began to pack up and curse. He was doing everything very quickly and awkwardly. It seemed he planned to disappear before Rowan arrived, but he didn't make it. He called the old man over to him. The old man no longer hid his fear. He even started to scream. He yelled that Rowan was mistaken and it wasn't him. After which, the man began to run, threatening not to approach him. Rowan patted Arvin on the back, as if praising him for calling him just in time. Then he crouched down and picked up a stone from the fire. And then, without thinking, he swung and threw it at the man, hitting him right in the head. The old man fell immediately. Rowan approached him. Then he grabbed the man, who was still conscious, and said that the stone was a warning, so he demanded to know what he was hiding in his bag. Before he could say anything, the bag fell to the ground, and out came hands. The others couldn't believe what they were seeing. Arvin realized they had been offered to eat human flesh. The old man understood he was a step away from death, so he began to justify himself, saying he hadn't killed those people, just taken the hands from the corpses. But Rowan didn't care why the old man wanted those pieces of meat. He wanted to know what that scumbag had seen. After all, those idiots had painted their symbol on the wall with blood, and the cannibal must have seen it. Beverian didn't understand what Rowan was talking about. It seemed he was hiding something. The man asked if they would let him go if they found out everything. But instead of an answer, Rowan just swung again, and it worked. He spoke of white cloaks and red scarves. Ruby knew what he was talking about. They had tied people up and thrown them to the zombies. 3 were bitten immediately, and the 4th escaped, although the man wasn't sure, as the scumbags had dragged him away with them. Rowan asked how many there were. The man had seen about a dozen, maybe more. After which, there was the sound of a weapon clicking. The old man realized what was coming. He began to scream that he had told everything and begged to be released. But before he could finish, a shot rang out. Rowan said that the man and Arvin were the same. Smart dead men? Now everything became clear. Those psychopaths were after them because they needed the boy. It seemed the masks were looking for such people, but now they had to be even more careful, as a whole crowd of vampires was lurking nearby. Bevrian began to shout at Rowan that the man was unarmed, and he could have easily let the old man go. But Rowan thought otherwise. The forest was like a snake's den. They had to be cautious. He advised Bevrian to tone down his kindness and forget about it, as he was sure those bastards were lurking nearby. Arvin and Ruby stood in stunned silence. They vividly remembered the mask that called Arvan brother. The teenagers were quiet, but each was thinking the same thing. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to the settlement of Pasco. It was Pasco himself, Rowan's friend, who agreed to shelter everyone. They even prepared a hot bath for their guests. Pasco reminded Rowan to let Booker know he made it here safely. After that, he handed him his radio and asked him not to smoke, since there were kids around. Rowan was so annoyed with everyone, especially with the kids, that he stepped outside, tossed his things at Arvan, and ordered him to take them to his room. Even though he was furious, he still threw away his cigarette. Arvin was surprised that Rowan didn't have a radio. The man next to him said it turned out he never took one with him. After all, he was always bombarded with people wanting to talk, and if he responded to everyone, he would have lost his mind long ago. And there was a reason why Rowan roamed between settlements. Not everyone was worth talking to. Sometimes harm could be done even from a distance. Ruby had already fallen asleep, while Arvin thought about how hard things must be for Rowan. He never talked to him about such serious matters. Meanwhile, Rowan was reporting over the radio about those he saw in Sector T-19. He asked Peter to send photos, as he didn't know him. It also turned out that after they left their last location, a mask had visited them. 8 people. Suddenly, Rowan fell silent. There was a pause. That was a very large number. He asked if he had misheard, but it turned out the mask had blown itself up. It was a kamikaze. They had strapped him with explosives. So the people nearby died, and the rest became infected over time. Booker urged Rowan to listen very carefully. They weren't just lunatics killing for fun. They were true maniacs craving blood. So Booker literally begged him to be careful. In the bag lay Arvin's drone. He was furious that Rowan had been carrying it around carelessly. However, Bevrian was surprised that his friend hadn't changed at all. His bag was still perfectly clean. But that wasn't the only surprise. Melanie. Bevrian didn't even notice the warm smile spreading across his face. She was here too. With such warm emotions, he closed the bag again. After that, Bevrian called Arvin and told him to take the drone for a spin. Practice wouldn't hurt him, although the man couldn't believe how easily this kid handled it. He explained to Arvin that his drone was best suited for transporting cargo because it was the strongest. The kid still couldn't believe it was his drone. Bevrian continued to ponder. An adult wouldn't fit in this drone, but Ruby, she weighed 42, so it was entirely possible. Arvin asked about Bevrian's drone, since it was the largest of them all. It turned out to be a stormtrooper class. The body was armored, and it had excellent weaponry, a lethal combination, but way too loud. Ruby's drone was a rescue model specializing in support. It was much smaller and had almost no protection, but it was fast and maneuverable. He mentioned that all of this was made by Dune's father. He was a true genius. All the residents of Amina had come to rely on him for many things. After that, an awkward silence fell between them. Bevrian understood why and was the first to bring up Dune, causing Arvin's hands to tremble suddenly. The man said that no one was to blame for his death, and that really helped Arvan. He felt a sense of relief. At that moment, Rowan appeared and asked where Bevrian's daughter was. It turned out she was in the bath. Rowan also couldn't help but praise Arvan's drone handling skills. He even called him a true professional. But he couldn't just praise him. He reminded Arvan that he needed to learn how to shoot, promising to call him a loser until his skills surpassed Bevrian's. The man realized that Rowan was drunk. He said that the masks had resorted to harsher methods and that a terrorist attack had occurred in one of the settlements. Rowan didn't say where exactly it happened. Bevrian said he was about to lose his mind, to which his friend replied that he didn't need any fools around. After all, he wanted to find their base as soon as possible. Bevrian asked if Rowan wanted to conduct a reconnaissance mission. But he wasn't planning on changing his route. They would just pay a friendly visit to the loners along the way. The border zone, no one had ventured there, so even Rowan didn't know what was happening. There were rumors that worse things than zombies existed in those parts. After that, he said that Arvin had potential since Rowan was training him, but he didn't understand what Princess Bevrian would be doing there. Suddenly, Arvin piped up, promising to protect her. Rowan said the teenagers were just gathering to die together. Then Bevrian intervened, saying he would teach her how to survive in that harsh world. He would start training the very next day, and she would be able to defend herself against any danger. And here came Ruby, just stepping out of the bath. Arvon asked if she was done, to which his friend asked where he had been. He explained that he was just showing Bevrian how to handle the drone. Ruby praised her friend. She knew he was really good at it. But then something got to her, and she started praising Arvon over and over. Suddenly, he grabbed her hands and shouted her name. For some reason, Arvin raised his voice and swore that he wouldn't regret his life to save her, so Ruby didn't need to worry. Of course, she was flattered, but she didn't know how to react in such an unexpected situation. What was happening? Meanwhile, the scene shifted to the street. Rowan said that where they were going, there were plenty of pollutants, so he could easily charge his drone. After that, he continued drinking. But Bevrian saw nothing good in that. The more pollutants there were, the fewer people there would be. The number of zombies wouldn't decrease as long as there was at least one source of that filth on the ground. They used it to charge the drone, even made a vaccine, but if you got too close to a zombie, that crap would instantly turn into poison. And anyone who didn't take the medicine would immediately become infected. Many people had already died, and many more would die. They would never get back that wonderful world they once lived in. Rowan seemed to share Bevrian's sorrow. Despite his stone heart, he had feelings too. Simon was their only hope, but maybe it was just an illusion. Meanwhile, morning arrived. Bevrian, as promised, had been training with his daughter since early morning. To start, he asked Ruby to show him everything she could do so he could understand how to train her. He suggested she try to hit his hand first. This fight would mark the beginning of her training. Ruby took the word fight too literally, so she lunged at her father, shouting. But in doing so, she completely lost her focus and slipped. And she began to fall. How embarrassing. She didn't even get a chance to strike. Ruby didn't rush to get up, thinking everyone would just assume she decided to lie down suddenly. But Rowan couldn't help but comment, saying the girl was simply amazing. What a reaction. What moves? Rowan was generous with compliments and praise. It had been a while since Ruby had embarrassed herself like that. But she wasn't giving up that easily. Round 2. Bevrian tried to support his daughter, telling her not to worry. And to attack! And this time it worked. She hit him squarely on the hand, and the strike was bold and strong. Ruby couldn't contain her joy. Well, what would Rowan say now? Bevrian was proud of his daughter too. She had plenty of strength. Ruby immediately looked at that bespectacled guy. She wanted to see his dumb face. But he wasn't even looking. Only Arvin was waving and shouting about how great Ruby was. Well, at least it was something. Meanwhile, night had fallen. The drone arrived at the location. Bevrian was in control, giving tips over the radio. The supply box was larger than the last time. And finally it landed. Ter did a great job, but how he hated manual control. But it turned out he had also changed something in the drone. He had added 2 extra batteries, which increased its weight. Ter had thought of his family and their friends, even increasing the first aid kit for Rowan. But he would probably refuse it since it was different from what Rowan was used to. The weapon was too heavy to send, so Ter advised just to be happy with the ammo. But if Bevrian really needed it, he could buy it since he was in the company of the best businessmen. After that, he wanted to say goodbye. It was late and time to sleep. So Bevrian thanked him for everything and left. Meanwhile, the scene shifted back to the settlement. There, Rowan was trying his best to express his dissatisfaction with the food without words. But eventually, he couldn't hold back and told Bevrian that it was nonsense. He said that the next day they would head to the next settlement and would again be jostling on horseback. But Rowan had said that those animals made too much noise in urban areas, and they were in one, so he suggested just walking. However, there was an unarguable point. On foot, they would take at least 4 days, while on horseback only 2. Rowan said they still had a long way to go to where he had seen Simon's tracks since the territory was no longer under their control, and another issue awaited them on the way. Bevrian simply agreed with everything and seemingly accidentally tossed broccoli into Rowan's plate. Meanwhile, the scene shifted back to the street. There was Arvin and Ruby. It turned out they decided to practice a bit before bed. The boy kept praising her, even for the smallest achievements. He said her strikes were getting better, but she needed to work on her battle cry. After which, he got hit by Ruby. Apparently, she had overdone it a bit, as Arvin couldn't hold back. And the two of them just fell. Honestly, from the outside, it looked very cute. Arvin touched her face to move her hair and chuckled at how clumsy Ruby was. They were so close, Ruby felt his cold breath on her. What a handsome guy he was. Ruby immediately blushed. She couldn't hide it. So she abruptly stood up and shouted that Arvin was a pervert. Then she called him a creep and ran away. Watching all this unfold in Ruby's screams, Rowan thought what a pervert Arvin was. Until a company approached him. It turned out to be Pasco. He asked if Rowan was sure he would be safe with those three. After all, his friend looked reliable. But the kids, Pasco offered to provide them with an escort, but Rowan didn't like crowds. He said he'd rather give him $5,000. It seemed Rowan was definitely a psycho, as where would they get that kind of money? Nearby, Taylor's drone was charging. Pasco knew that only people from Amina used drones, and he had heard they controlled them using brain impulses. The man seemed genuinely interested in watching this. Rowan complained that he still hadn't gotten a drone, and Pasco asked if he had forgotten to take his medicine. But how could he forget that when he took it 3 times a day, because he had someone obsessed with safety around him? Pasco said that Rowan had found a good friend, to which he fell silent, but mentioned that Mass would likely visit them the next day, so he asked him to be careful. Meanwhile, morning arrived. Bevrian asked his daughter if she really wanted to ride a horse by herself. He would have allowed it if Ruby could, but his daughter didn't let her dad finish, as she could. Arvin had taught her. He didn't want to take responsibility for that, so he was going to object since Ruby wasn't that skilled. But she didn't let that idiot finish and instead hit him hard. Suddenly, Rowan intervened as if he couldn't be left out. He told Ruby to give it a try, as if she succeeded, they would have room for extra cargo. Arvin told everyone not to worry because he would take care of Ruby. Bevrian thought, if even Rowan didn't mind. He agreed, but first gave Ruby a lecture about the rules she needed to follow. But he wasn't a tyrant, so he let his daughter enjoy herself. Now she named the horse Horsey and hugged it tightly. Arvin couldn't take his eyes off Ruby. He loved watching his friend glow with happiness. Suddenly, someone placed a hand on his shoulder, and it was anything but friendly. It was Rowan, and he threatened to chop the boy's head off if anything happened to Ruby. After that, he vanished immediately, which was totally his style. Arvin tried to argue that Rowan was the first to support Ruby, but he just didn't have the chance. Suddenly, someone called him. It was Ruby. She wanted to ask what horses ate and if Horsey would like it if she braided its mane. And that made his heart melt once again. Arvin realized he would have to entertain Ruby, or those two would just beat him up. But before he could say that horses loved carrots, a loud scream suddenly echoed. A man was running toward them, calling for Rowan, saying they had big problems. The man could barely say 2 words. His tongue kept stuttering, and he urged them to return to the gates immediately. One of those taken by the loners had returned, but he had completely changed. Pasco and his partner were deciding what to do, as it was Peter. What had those bastards done to him? The likes of this zombie had never been seen before. It was just a giant monster. Right now, that monster was like a walking pollutant. After the first shot, everything around would become infected with the virus. Before firing, they needed to spray everything with antiseptic, because if the loners had turned Peter into one of them, no medicine in the world would help. The partner didn't pressure him, but ordered Pasco to decide quickly, as they couldn't let the monster get too close. But Pasco asked Tuca to be quiet for a moment because the monster suddenly froze. After that, it looked up, as if intentionally searching for friends. Pasco told Peter to speak, as they were listening, and the monster spoke. It struggled to pronounce Pasco's name, finding it very difficult. After that, the zombie asked to be killed, to be freed from this suffering. Pasco didn't think long and grabbed his weapon. Tuca didn't even have time to object. After that, a shot rang out, and even the others heard it. Specially trained people in suits rushed onto the battlefield. While Tuca couldn't believe that Pasco had actually done it. Those people sprayed antiseptic and other substances to make the area less dangerous. Meanwhile, Pasco descended to Peter. The green liquid, which was obviously the virus, spilled around. Pasco silently lit a match and threw it. He burned his friend. Meanwhile, Rowan arrived. Pasco thought they had already left. He hadn't expected to see him. He told Rowan that it was dangerous here without a mask, but Rowan reminded him that Pasco hadn't been careful either. To which Pasco replied that he could be replaced by anyone, unlike Rowan. Meanwhile, Peter's body was already burning. Zombies burned very quickly. Rowan said that before shooting, they should have treated the zombie first, after which he scolded him. Pasco replied that he thought Peter was in a lot of pain and was suffering, especially since the zombie had asked him to shoot him. Rowan couldn't believe it. Pasco had made the biggest mistake. First of all, he could have told them something truly important. And then Rowan couldn't say more, as the screams started again. A person in a gas mask ran in and said there were many zombies here. They were attracted by the smell of the campfire, the poor guy managed to say, before a zombie pounced on him. He tried to fight back, but without a weapon, it was impossible. Pasco and Rowan realized that their situation was simply terrible. The number of zombies was increasing. Rowan had a weapon, so he shot the first few. Pasco joined his partner. Suddenly, Rowan ran out of ammo. Luckily, Pasco had a spare. There were so many zombies that Rowan didn't even notice one behind him. But then Bevrian appeared and just took that noob down. Rowan should have been grateful to him. After that, a drone suddenly descended and just opened fire on all of them. The zombies were distracted by the sound, like little kids. After that, Arvin appeared and immediately punched the stupid monster right in the face. It seemed he was controlling the drone. This kid was really skilled. But then Arvin started looking for his friends. When he saw Rowan, he shouted. He immediately ran up to his teacher, worried for his life. Rowan didn't forget to thank Arvin for covering him in time, but at that moment, another stupid zombie appeared behind him. Arvin asked if the teacher was okay, as he looked a bit confused. Suddenly, music blared and bright lights turned on, like at a disco. It was Ruby's drone! The zombies were once again lured by this bait. All their attention was focused on this toy. Even the rest were surprised why the zombies suddenly froze. But they quickly realized it was help, so they needed to shoot at the stupid monsters quickly. So the zombies immediately got a bullet in the head. Ruby saw everything and couldn't help but feel happy that they managed to help their friends. So now the guys could calmly deal with everything. Rowan asked where his friend's stormtrooper was, but he was with Ruby. He thought the drone was needed here, but Bevrian said the stormtrooper was protecting his daughter. Suddenly, that masked man screamed again, but now his voice was even more terrified. And all because there was a kamikaze! Rowan and Bevrian couldn't believe it. It was obvious, but they hadn't thought it would happen so soon. The zombie was completely covered in explosives. Rowan knew the history of the former settlement and understood that they simply had no chance. After all, no one had a chance against something like that. They would all die right now. Rowan looked at his friend. He was scared and seemed not to understand the full danger. However, Rowan understood. He realized that Bevrian had a daughter. Suddenly, he reached for Arvin. The boy was in shock, not understanding what was happening. And so he didn't even notice how Arvin grabbed him. Bevrian caught this out of the corner of his eye and seemed to begin to understand what would happen next. Rowan threw Arvin right into the monster's arms. Nothing was visible, only darkness surrounded them. Why? What happened? Rowan, Bevrian, why are they silent? His eyes couldn't open. How tired he was. He needed to sleep. Just a few minutes, no more. Ruby sat on the same bench with the same drones. Her small body trembled with fear and anxiety. All her emotions suddenly mixed together. After all, her drone was there. Ruby saw everything. Rowan got a solid slap across the face. It was Bevrian. The nurses yelled at him for treating an injured person like that. But Rowan deserved it. It was barely enough for such a scumbag. He didn't even try to dodge. He just let Bevrian do his thing. The nurses couldn't watch it any longer. But Bevrian didn't stop. He was furious. Until that scumbag Rowan started gasping for air. Then Bevrian calmed down a bit. That idiot even had the nerve to speak. He simply said it was the price for saving their lives. Bevrian couldn't believe it. He didn't even feel sorry. He didn't regret what he did at all. He didn't mourn for Arvin. Then Bevrian realized that beating this scumbag wouldn't make any difference and wouldn't bring him happiness. It wouldn't change anything. Because it wouldn't change the fact that Rowan abandoned Arvin and let him get blown up by zombies. That was it. Ruby was still sitting alone, but now in a different spot by the door of the ward. She looked at the photo she took with Arvin. 2 nurses came out of the ward. One of them could barely hold back her tears and said it was unbearable to look at that body. The boy was still breathing. So they thought there might still be a chance. Ruby heard this and desperately wanted to believe it. She had to see Arvin. She had to know what was happening to him. But right before the entrance, a man stopped her. Tuka. He said Ruby couldn't go any further because the site was not for the faint-hearted. Not for the faint-hearted. Those words made tears spring to Ruby's eyes, even though she thought she had no more tears left to cry. What happened to him? What happened to her, Arvin? Tears streamed down her cheeks. She didn't move from her spot. In the meantime, they brought in the contaminants. Rowan brought them and insisted they give them to Arvin by any means necessary. The nurse was puzzled. She doubted this treatment method at all. But Rowan told her not to worry and asked her to keep him updated on the boy's condition. After that, he left the ward. Why? Why was he allowed to? What right did he have? Bevrian was waiting by the door and said Arvin was 1 foot in the grave. But now his condition was stable, and something told him that Rowan was counting on this. That scumbag was silent, but Bevrian stood his ground. Not this time. He demanded answers. What was he trying to achieve with this? Rowan asked him not to think he had a plan. Everything just happened on its own. When he saw the kamikaze right in front of them, he realized the explosion was unavoidable. And trying to shield himself, he threw Arvin away. Rowan also added that he didn't regret it one bit. It was the right choice. The death of one boy meant nothing compared to the greater good. That was the last straw. Bevrian couldn't stand this ungrateful scumbag's nonsense anymore. Who gave him the right to decide who lives and who dies? Bevrian declared that Ruby and Arvin would stay in this place while the boy recovered. They would continue their journey together. So he was entirely at the service of their greater good. Rowan was silent. He had nothing to say. Coward. Meanwhile, Ruby was outside on that same bench. Her dad was with her, telling her not to worry. They would return as soon as they found those records. But she had to stay. Dad asked if Ruby understood everything, and she nodded, holding back tears. Bevrian recognized his daughter. The nurses allowed Ruby to stay with them for a while. It would be safer, and she would be closer to Arvin. After those words, Ruby hugged her dad tightly. For what? She didn't even know. Just for being there for her. She asked him to promise he would take care of himself. Her dad squeezed her even tighter and promised. He had a reason to live. He had someone to live for. Meanwhile, Tuka was sitting by Arvin's door, keeping watch. Suddenly, he noticed Bevrian. He knew him as Rowan's friend. Bevrian was heading to Arvin's ward. Tuka asked if the man was sure he wanted to see that. The boy wasn't even bandaged yet. The man was surprised they hadn't wrapped him up yet, but it turned out they were told that could hinder regeneration. Suddenly, some pieces started falling into place in his mind. He saw him on the bed. What he saw was simply horrifying. You couldn't look without tears. But he couldn't just leave the ward like that. This boy, he had been through so much. And Bevrian understood perfectly that he was alive only because of that brave boy. He was still a child. Bevrian's heart was breaking. He liked Arvin, and that poor kid definitely didn't deserve any of this. Meanwhile, events shifted to the street. Dad gave Ruby a radio and promised to return very soon. He asked her to call immediately if anything happened. Ruby nodded bravely, agreeing. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him, Rowan. But in that same second, she turned her head to avoid making eye contact. Ruby hated him. Now she had a reason to. Finally, Dad asked Ruby to keep an eye on Arvin. After that, they left. Ruby was alone again, but this time she was brave. Rowan didn't turn back even once the whole time. Bevrian kept an eye on him. Time passed like that. They rode on horseback in silence. Suddenly, something seemed odd to Bevrian. He called out to Rowan and asked if he didn't think they were heading the wrong way, but Rowan didn't even turn around. Then out of nowhere, Bevrian heard zombies. One appeared out of nowhere and suddenly lunged at him. But Bevrian wasn't one to be scared. He immediately punched that scumbag right in the face. After that, he secured the result with a shot. He yelled again at Rowan. Was that idiot deaf? But instead of a response, Rowan just shot another zombie in the head that was ahead of them. After which, he immediately rode ahead, ignoring Bevrian. He was fed up with all this. He sped past Rowan and blocked his path. What was that scumbag doing? Rowan casually and calmly replied that he was just shortening the route. Then he turned around and prepared to ride on. But Bevrian wasn't going to let this go. He grabbed Rowan by the arm, and he fell. Bevrian didn't want that. Rowan just fell off his horse. His partner immediately felt ashamed for everything. Rowan was holding a weapon in his hand. He started apologizing, but suddenly fell silent. Rowan's eyes? He was crying. Bevrian couldn't believe it. That scumbag really had feelings? He had a heart? Rowan was the first to speak, so Beverian wouldn't ask about his eyes, saying they shouldn't have gotten off their horses since there were plenty of zombies around. Then he asked if Beverian was scared of a few living dead. He was disappointing him, just like always in Rowan's style, making a joke. To be honest, Beverian felt ashamed. He had thought so poorly of his partner. Meanwhile, events shifted to the shelter. Ruby was looking at the drones, then at the photo she was holding. She remembered the promise she made to herself back when Arvon suddenly disappeared. Hope was with Pasco. Ruby wanted him to train her. She wanted to learn how to shoot and defend herself. She chose Pasco because he looked like the most important guy in the settlement. Ruby was simply charming, so his heart melted. He decided to start with running, 10 laps around the building. The girl asked if it could be better to do 5 since it was her first training. Pasco only dropped it to 7. After that, he suddenly asked if Ruby thought Rowan was a bad person. She didn't even know how to respond. He would always be like that. Nothing would change him. Ruby asked how long Pasco had been friends with Rowan, to which the man suddenly laughed. He said that wasn't quite the right question, but Ruby didn't understand. Then Pasco asked if she hadn't figured everything out yet after what happened to Arvin. Rowan had no friends. They just used each other for survival. Ruby could ask him personally, but Pasco had no doubt the answer would be the same. But he told Ruby not to worry when he saw her scared eyes. After all, neither her father nor she would ever be harmed by Rowan, because the most dangerous people to him were the residents of Amina. Beverian suddenly blocked Rowan's path again. He decided to finally ask why his partner was acting like that, since what was wrong with shortening the road. Beverian suggested they stop for a break, because Rowan, in his opinion, looked bad. He couldn't believe it was that noticeable, but it seemed like Rowan was about to fall off his horse. He probably hadn't recovered from the explosion yet. Rowan didn't seem to mind, but this place wasn't the best. They should move further away. But Beverian didn't want to hear any of it. Rowan needed to lie down for an hour, and his partner would keep watch. Meanwhile, a fire was already lit. Rowan wasn't happy about that either. Did Beverian want the whole area to know where they were? But his partner wasn't listening. On the contrary, he grabbed Rowan's hand and rolled up his sleeve. It turned out Beverian was planning to improve that idiot's immune system a bit. Rowan tried to resist, but he had no strength left, not even for those snarky jokes. Then he asked why Beverian was healthy since the explosion had hit him too. His partner said he always did good deeds, so that was why. God. But then Rowan suddenly agreed. Beverian had always been so soft and kind, and also a complete idiot. His partner stared at that opossum. Then he asked if anyone had told Rowan he was crazy. Meanwhile, events shifted to Pasco's settlement. Ruby had been training there since early morning. Finally, she shouted a victorious cry. Because this was her 7th lap. She was so tired. She called for her dad. Ruby said that the next day they needed to run at least 8 laps when suddenly the radio spoke up. Dad actually picked up. Ruby's fatigue vanished instantly. How nice it was to hear his voice. The girl asked if Beverian had reached the next settlement. It turned out they had been walking all night and arrived quickly, but Dad was tired because of it. His daughter didn't intend to hold Beverian back, so Dad promised to call back when he woke up. In the meantime, he didn't notice when a nurse entered the ward. He asked if Rowan had already been given everything he needed, after which he requested them to be careful since the poor guy was getting bruises right away. The nurse asked how Beverian was feeling, but he didn't need anything. Suddenly, the woman's cheeks turned red. Meanwhile, the nurse had already left the ward, but was still peeking in. She met Laura and asked if she knew who was close to Rowan. It turned out he called him his friend, and that surprised everyone since Rowan had never called anyone that in his life. The nurse said she hadn't seen anyone care for Rowan like that, and he even spoke like a prince from a fairy tale. She almost offered him her hand and heart. Meanwhile, Rowan had already woken up. He felt very beaten up. He was outraged that it was worth sleeping for an hour, and they had already done something to his arm, and there was still so much left. What were they even pouring into him? Then Rowan looked at his friend. Beverian was asleep, and suddenly memories flooded him. Rowan didn't understand back then. Why did everyone say he was wrong? After all, he did what he had to. But then why? Did Beverian say he needed to be kicked out? What was he supposed to do now? Where to go? He had begged Beverian to help him back then. How painful it was to remember all this. Meanwhile, Ruby spent her time as usual, by Arvin's ward. Tuka came out and saw the girl again. He was so fed up with her sleeping in that spot all the time. Everyone in the shelter knew that Arvin was supposed to have real regeneration. It was just incredible. It was impossible. Just a day and a whole finger had grown back. Incredible. At this rate, in a month, the boy would be completely healthy. Ruby was asleep, not noticing how someone approached her. The man tapped her on the head and asked if anyone was home. Then he said it was cool here, and she'd better go to her room. Ruby hadn't even noticed how night had fallen, and she missed dinner. Tuka also threatened that if she caught a cold, she wouldn't be allowed to sit there. Ruby understood everything. Eventually, the man couldn't take it anymore and felt sorry for the girl. So he said that in 2 weeks she would be able to see Arvin, so there was just a little bit left.